Chapter 1471. The wizards of Sassard stared at the sizable fleet in a daze. Between the overgrown branches, silver warships reflected the sun's rays, sparkling with a clear radiance. That was the Kanaki's fleet. Among the Bugit craftsmen, Kanaki's floating warships were one of the most advanced. Although the wizards of Sassard didn't want to admit it, they had to admit that the Tonajul's fleet was even more powerful than theirs. This was what angered the wizards of Sassard and Vladimir the Great. They thought that William had betrayed the Bugit. That's a fleet that the Kanaki helped the mortals build, and it's the only army in this fortress that poses a threat to us. That's why we can't invade this fortress from the sky. The leader of the wizards turned around, check if there's a forbidden zone for teleportation magic. Soon, expressions of shock appeared on the faces of the adepts. There's no forbidden zone for teleportation. These mortals. The leader of the wizards couldn't help but laugh bitterly. But it was understandable. After all, in the mortal world, there were only a few wizards who could cast teleportation spells. Setting up a forbidden zone for teleportation would cost a lot, not to mention covering such a large area. Mortals had their own way of thinking. Their way of fighting was very different from the wizards, so it was normal for them to think this way. He pointed at a place. We'll teleport to the middle of the branches first. Understood. The light spirit had created a huge cavity in the interior of Valhalla. Countless branches extended from the tree walls, coiling around the bottom of the cavity like aerial roots. There, several dozen giant magic engines were rumbling all day long, converting the pure mana from the magic crystal ores and pouring it into the crystal tower in the center. Above the cavity, a dazzling artificial sun was suspended. Countless light spots flew around the artificial sun, illuminating the interior of the cavity as bright as day. Below the crystal tower, the light spirit Monica was talking to a blurry white figure. The energy efficiency of the slate is beyond our imagination. At this rate, the bottom layer of the network will be fully charged. However, you have only just gained consciousness. It will take some time for you to familiarize yourself with your body. The figure slowly nodded. It seemed to be a young girl with long hair draped over her shoulders. She was wearing a green leaf robe, but her figure was blurry and shrouded in a white light. Do you want to check your body again? That's good as well. The faster you familiarize yourself with it, the faster you can make it move. Even though this is only Valhalla's initial form, from the moment you were born, it already possessed the embryonic form of that super fortress of the past. The girl slowly closed her eyes, but after a while, she suddenly opened them strangely. What happened? I sense an unfamiliar intruder. Intruder? Monica was stunned. What kind of person is he? They seem to be the silver folk, but their bloodline seems to have deteriorated greatly. I can feel the aura of a manager from them. They should be the descendants of the observers. Oh, the Bugit people. Monica thought for a moment and said, the uninvited guys should be the people from Taraki. Can I take a look at them? The girl nodded. After a while, Monica saw 7 or 8 gray-robed wizards appear in the light screen in front of her. They were in the nearby hills, drawing a magic circle on the ground. Even though the light spirit did not recognize the magic circle, it did not stop her from guessing that it was a teleportation circle. It really is these guys. Monica, I don't like these people. They are spying on me without my permission. They seem to want to teleport into my body. Can I refuse their teleportation request? I don't like it either. Monica frowned. Can you deal with them? Yes. Oh, but wait. The light spirit suddenly thought of something. No need to go through so much trouble. Send them to Area 41. The girl thought for a while. Valhalla was like a body to her. However, Area 41 could only be regarded as a subsidiary building of this fortress and was not in her body. She thought for a while before she remembered that place. Mr. Babu, please allow me to disturb you for a moment. Lady Monica asked me to send some intruders to you. Is that okay? The giant craftsman Babu was completing his meditation for the day. The cloud giants did not need to eat and rarely needed to sleep. Tiamat's network would automatically transmit energy to them. However, in the morning of the day, they would meditate and pray. Such religious rituals had been passed down for thousands of years and had long become a tradition in the blood of every cloud giant. However, the girl's voice still made him look up. He replied gracefully, "Lady World Tree, it is the honor of the giants to be able to serve you. Those intruders, where are they?" As soon as the gray-robed wizard stepped into the teleportation circle, the scenery in front of them blurred. However, what reappeared in their vision was not the tree hall in the middle of Valhalla, but an even more magnificent, classical marble palace full of classical beauty. Every single one of the pillars that supported the vault was shockingly huge. They were so huge that one had to raise their heads to look at them. They were arranged one after another, densely packed together. The cloud patterns on the floor of the hall set off the floating clouds outside the rows of pillars. It was like a legendary temple in the clouds. Every piece of furniture in the hall set off the insignificance of the wizards. The gray-robed wizards were completely stunned. This was the residence of the legendary giants. What kind of place did their teleportation spell bring them to? However, they immediately understood. A giant in a white robe with curly hair slowly walked out of the darkness and came to them. The giant had long, bright golden hair and eyes as blue as the sea. His clothes were as white as snow, and every crease seemed to be filled with golden threads. They sparkled under the sunlight. His bearing was graceful and noble, like an elegant statue. This was not the legendary man-eating giant in the wilderness, nor was it the despicable and cruel descendant of the legendary giant gods. It was a real giant, a cloud giant. The giant looked down at these tiny invaders. "Buga people, Taraki people," the giant said one by one. His voice was like thunder, echoing in the hall. "Why did you come here with evil intentions? I can feel the depraved aura on you. Have the proud silver folk of the past also surrendered to the Twilight Dragon?" The sorcerers were all stunned. They looked at each other. After a while, the leading wizard replied with trepidation, "Sir, are you really a cloud giant? I still remember the days when I fought alongside the Taraki people." Barb closed his eyes and recalled. "Ah!" The leading wizard seemed to have been struck by lightning. You are the god of craftsmen, Barb." "Yes, you are the descendant of Korakik." "I feel the aura of the arcane realm's law on you," Barb replied. The leader of the wizards began to tremble. He replied cautiously, "That was my grandfather, my lord. Descendant of Korakik, your grandfather died in the Sixth War. He died together with the Crystal Cluster Lord. It was I who personally sent his bones back to Taraki," Barb replied. "Your grandfather's soul rose to the sky and turned into a star, watching the actions of his descendants. Did your choice today really let the heroic spirits of your ancestors rest in peace?" The adepts fell silent. "We are trapped by our mission, sir," the leading wizard replied. "Not every Taraki person supports the actions of Sir Wizard and Sir Vladimir the Great, but the Buga people have indeed fallen for a long time. The war slate is very important to us. We need to rely on it to achieve our former glory." "What is true glory, descendant of Korakik?" Barb replied. "Your grandfather's generation lost the Great Silver Library, but no one dared to say that they were despicable. When their souls were sublimated in that war, they gained their own glory. What about you?" The wizards stood there looking at each other, not knowing how to refute. "Tell me," Barb replied softly. "Descendant of Korakik, what is your choice?" The wizards had no choice but to bow their heads. It was the cloud giant, the purest generation of the metal people. It was also the god of craftsmen, Barb. When he became famous, the Sixth War had not yet ended. The 8 wizards knelt on one knee one by one and put their hands on their chests. "We are willing to serve you, Sir Barb." "Not for me," Barb shook his head. "You will serve the ruler of this world." The wizards were slightly stunned, and their faces showed a stunned expression. In the hollow hall of the middle layer of Valhalla, the roar of machinery was still there. Monica could not help but wrinkle her nose after hearing the description from the girl in front of her. They actually surrendered. What cowards! The light spirit was very dissatisfied. "If I knew this would happen, I would have rejected their teleportation request and thrown these despicable fellows into the turbulence of space." The girl who had just gained consciousness did not understand why Monica was angry. She just tilted her head and looked at the scene with some confusion. "Forget it." Monica suddenly flew up and circled around the crystal tower. "I knew Barb and the others would not do anything to the Buga people." But at this moment, she suddenly felt a heat in her chest. Monica's expression changed slightly. She hurriedly picked up a gemstone from the clothes woven by light. The dark red gemstone was the size of a human's little thumb, but the size of the light spirit's palm. And at this moment, an obvious crack appeared on the gemstone. Monica's face turned pale. Chapter 1472. The violent explosion caused Allium Japonicum to lose consciousness for a few seconds. When she regained consciousness, her ears were still ringing with buzzing sounds and her vision had turned dark red due to congestion. However, her mind was still clear. 6th Circle Flux Spell, Two-Headed Snake. The spell had cut into the north base of the tower at 11 o'clock. The caster was within 100 feet, which meant that they were at least elemental awakened. As an outstanding flux magician and elemental user, Allium Japonicum wasn't the slightest bit unfamiliar with magic. The battle between players was even more intense than this. She could also instantly determine the number of casters and their positions. This was an innate talent and also one of the reasons why she was called a first-rate caster. Allium Japonicum understood that Two-Headed Snake was a multi-stage spell. The magic power would be compressed below the point of explosion and very quickly, a second explosion would occur. This was a spell specially used to deal with the enemy inside the stronghold. She still had a short moment of opportunity. The female knight used all her strength to lift off the rocks on her body. Enduring the stinging pain all over her body, she crawled up from the ruins. The sharp pain in her chest made her see stars and she didn't know how many of her ribs had been broken. Moreover, there was a large area of burn on her arm. Her originally snow-white skin was ashy black. The knight's uniform hung on her hand in tatters and the metal armor had also melted and distorted due to the high temperature. However, Allium Japonicum couldn't care less. She clenched her teeth and rolled down the tower which had long been turned into a pile of rubble. A muffled explosion came from the ground and an enormous force sent her flying. She fell heavily on the ground more than 10 meters away. She groaned and coughed out a mouthful of blood, but immediately crouched down. A series of explosions came from the ruins of the tower and the hot wind almost roasted her back. A few pieces of rubble flew out and hit her shoulder, immediately turning it into a bloody mess. However, Allium Japonicum didn't utter a sound. She calmly maintained her consciousness and crouched down on the ground. The ground was violently shaking. The opponent's spellcaster didn't seem to care about his own people. The spell spread to both sides of the battle and after the storm of flames, several dozen charred corpses were left on the ruins. "Miss Maynard! Commander!" Cries of surprise rose and fell one after another on the city wall. Different names came from her knight colleagues and the cold-shirt subordinates. In the midst of the fierce battle, the people finally realized the situation here and realized that their commander was still on the tower. Allium Japonicum squinted his left eye. Blood flowed out of his eye and dyed half of his face red. In his blurred vision, he saw someone running in his direction. At the same time, a a red flag was raised on the city wall. It was the Redo's flag. The veteran of the November War decisively took over her command. Allium Japonicum breathed a sigh of relief. Another fireball exploded on the city wall, and several knights perished in the sea of fire. More people were blocked on the other side. Narrowing her eyes, Allium Japonicum understood that the enemy had locked onto her position. It seemed that not only Oberway, but there was also a traitor among the people around her. But this was not surprising. Maynard was originally a member of the royal faction. There was no guarantee that there was no spy among her personal night guards. She remembered that one of the guards was Oberway's second son. That young man was one of Maynard's many admirers. Allium Japonicum squinted her eyes and remembered that the young man volunteered to scout before the battle began. He had not returned yet. Presumably, he would not come back. Judging from the direction of the attack, the rebels had at least crossed the Orda River. It was impossible for them to sneak past Fort Paris without alerting anyone. They had spent at least a week planning the attack, and they had to hide it from everyone. This meant that there was a problem with someone important in the whole process. Allium Japonicum did not expect that Oberway would betray the royal family of Covardo. In the past, this lone wolf of the kingdom did not hesitate to break ties with the royal faction. He insisted on standing on the side of Her Royal Highness, and finally died in the Battle of the Crimson Canyon. He was the hero of the Eruin people. Why did history have such a big deviation? Did the Bugis have such magic? But there was no doubt that the enemy's target was her. The Bugis wanted to destroy the Tonajul people's resistance. Allium Japonicum felt a little regretful. If she had known this would happen, she would have listened to Monica's advice. But there was no if in history. She could not have imagined that she would fall into such a trap when she was just helping the retreat of Minta. There was a tower at 11 o'clock. After a few rounds of fighting, it fell into the hands of the rebels. Allium Japonicum silently calculated the direction of the attack. At the same time, her right hand reached to her waist and pulled out a crossbow. It was an exquisite weapon. The crossbow was made of steel, and the bowstring was woven with animal tendons and fibers soaked in oil. The crossbow was also engraved with magic patterns and magic circles. It was a weapon that she had made herself. She put the crossbow close to her mouth and tried to bite the bowstring with her teeth. Then, she took a magic arrow from the wrist guard on her wrist and pushed it on the rail with her chin. Allium Japonicum hid the crossbow under her body and took out another crossbow. She loaded it with the guidance arrow that she had commissioned Tamar to make. Finally, she took out a third crossbow from her calf. This crossbow was much bigger than the previous two. It looked more like a light crossbow. She spread out her 4 arms and carefully pushed a black-bladed crossbow bolt onto the trajectory. Allium Japonicum placed the 3 crossbows in front of her and took a deep breath. She seemed to be talking to herself. "I'll leave the rest to you, little girl. None of us want to die, right? What a lucky fellow." When the Magus in the tower saw Allium Japonicum escape, he only thought that it was a fluke. He leapt out of the tower with his staff in hand and landed lightly on the city walls. The battle on the city walls had long since ended, leaving only smoke and charred corpses. However, an endless stream of rebel soldiers were climbing up the city walls, quickly blocking the path ahead. The Magus' expression was cold as he pushed with his hand. An invisible force threw the soldiers off the walls. The noble soldiers immediately broke out in an uproar, but the knight among them immediately reprimanded them to prevent them from throwing their lives away. The knight looked at the red-robed Magus with some fear, and they spontaneously ordered their attendants to open up a path for him. A strange scene appeared on the city walls. A Magus passed through the chaotic army in an orderly manner, neither too fast nor too slow. The streets near the city walls were already filled with smoke and dust. The Magus slowly passed through the buildings that had been reduced to rubble, and soon saw the female knight lying motionless on the ground behind the smoke. He recognized that it was the main target of his trip. He shook his hand and a scroll slid down from his sleeve. He stopped 30 or 40 feet away and pointed his wand at Bai Jia while chanting in a low voice. However, the female knight had already gotten up from the ground, a crossbow in her hand. Without a second thought, she pulled the trigger. It was a movement that had been perfected over and over again. In any place in Aween, it would be difficult to find such a perfect tactical movement from any lord's knight. The owner of the crossbow had once graduated from the Royal Knight Academy with the best results. She was also the captain of Her Highness Knight Guards. At the age of 19, the female knight was already one of the best among her peers. Her name was Maynard. That lady knight who was as cold as ice, the dream lover of countless knights who were unable to obtain her. With the crossbow in her hands, her battle instincts returned to her. She shot out a bait arrow, and it was aimed at her opponent. He was an elemental ranker, which meant that she only had one chance to attack. However, one chance was more than enough. The arrow hit the magic shield in front of the magus, and as expected, the transparent spherical force field bounced off the steel arrow. However, the bait arrow was made of unstable magic crystals embedded in the arrowhead. When the unstable crystals were shaken, they would release the magic within. Such a release usually meant an explosion, but the spell formation Tamar had created on the crystal allowed the magic to spread out in an orderly manner, forming ripples. Colorful lights suddenly appeared beside the magus. Maynard didn't need to turn around to see the magus' expression of shock and anger to understand what had happened. The triggering spell has been triggered, but there may be 1 or 2 life-saving triggering spells left. Be careful. Allium Japonicum reminded Maynard. The female knight didn't stop and immediately picked up the second crossbow. When the magus saw the crossbow, he knew that he had met the most despicable opponent, the witch hunter. But the information clearly said that the opponent was a knight. He secretly cursed the heretics who provided the information, and at the same time, gave up on casting spells and hurriedly retreated. The anti-magic arrow was shot out and once again hit his magic shield. The light of magic lit up again, and the arrow was bounced off as expected. However, this time, the magic shield on the magus body flickered and then shattered. The anti-magic arrow was made of cold iron. This type of metal was highly lethal to creatures and could also interfere with the operation of magic. After being processed by alchemists, the anti-magic arrow could often cause magic shields to withstand more attacks than they could bear and lose their effectiveness in an instant. Unfortunately, the craftsmanship of the anti-magic arrow in this era was still stagnant. After the Slate War, the anti-magic arrows made by the mortals could often directly penetrate most magic shields. Damn it! The magus was somewhat surprised by the opponent's complete preparation. He had already realized that the woman was luring him to come closer, but she had clearly escaped by luck. The magus felt a little strange, but more than that, he was angry. The witch hunter was undoubtedly a despicable profession in the eyes of the magus. It only took 3 to 5 years to train a witch hunter, but the time for an excellent magus to grow was easily calculated by 10 years. Being threatened by a witch hunter was like a noble gentleman being challenged by a lowly person. It made him feel humiliated. Chapter 1473. Especially since he was not an ordinary wizard. The anger in his heart burned, and he was angry that he had been miscalculated by a mortal twice in a row. Did the other party think that they could deal with the descendants of the silver with their pitiful tricks? The Bugis Sky Kingdom should have been destroyed long ago. The wizard slammed the staff in his hand on the ground. There was no trigger spell, no magic shield, but he still had magic items and all kinds of storage items. If one were to say who was as rich as a country in this world, then except for the ill-gotten wealth that the dragons had plundered everywhere, the craftsman wizards were the undisputed number one. And the ingenious Bugis would not simply store their treasures in dark caves like the miserly dragons. They had not seen the light of day for thousands of years, and they were better at using their wealth than anyone else. Almost every Bugha was armed to the teeth when they went out. Therefore, in the thousands of years of history, there were very few Bugha sorcerers who died by accident. Almost every craftsman sorcerer was synonymous with a long life. But that was all in the past. Just like what this wizard never thought was that his opponent was not a witch hunter. The other party's soul once belonged to a wizard, and was far better than his. No one in this world knew their opponents better than the wizards themselves. What's more, in another time and space, there were countless silver folk who fell in the Slate War. The staff touched the ground, and a visible shock wave spread from that point, pointing straight at Maynard. But the female knight had already turned over from the ground, twisted her posture in midair, and rolled to one side, narrowly avoiding the shock wave, and landed on the ground. At the same time, she held up the third crossbow in her hand, which was also the largest one. There was a blade-shaped black bolt on the crossbow. When the wizard saw the bolt, his face changed dramatically. Fenrir's tooth. He almost screamed. He could not understand in his dreams why a mortal would have such a terrible thing in her hands, and why this woman knew that Fenrir's tooth had a destructive effect on the Bughas. Subconsciously, he stepped back and activated the teleportation array on his robe. However, it was still too late. Maynard pulled the trigger and fired the last bolt. She didn't even aim at the wizard. It just flew past him like a sharp blade. The lines of law that had just lit up around the wizard seemed to have been cut off by this blade, and they all dimmed. The gray robe, magic staff, rings, and necklaces on his hands all lost their luster, as if they had turned back into ordinary objects in an instant. The demonic wolf Fenrir's fangs, which had the power to bite through all the laws, instantly erased the connection between the Tiamat law network and all the magical items in its path. Other than the divine weapons that had their own set of laws, all the items below the level of ancient items were rendered ineffective. But if any random Bugha wizard had a divine artifact, Allium Japonicum felt that he could die without regrets. Clearly, the other party didn't. There was a look of extreme horror on the wizard's face. He threw away the magic staff in his hand in a panic. At this moment, it had become an ordinary wooden root, and then turned to flee. He now regretted it. Because of his previous arrogance and rudeness, the mortal soldiers and knight were too far away from him. Those who could protect him now didn't even notice the changes that had happened here in an instant. No matter how good the Bughas were as the silver folk, a wizard was still a wizard. At this distance, a wizard who had lost all his defensive abilities could not be a match for a swordsman. Maynard casually tossed her crossbow aside, drew her knight's rapier, and shot out like an arrow. She was already close to elemental awakening, and a distance of a few dozen feet was nothing more than an instant for her. At the last moment, the wizard struggled to cast a low-level lightning-type spell, but the sparks only made the female knight frown. Maynard's steel-like will allowed her to break through the spell and stab her sword into the wizard's chest. The Bugha Magus screamed in agony, his silver-gray eyes revealing a look of disbelief. He reached out helplessly as if to grab Maynard, but could only wave his hand in the air in vain, making a hoarse sound in his throat. Indifferently, Maynard pressed her hand on his shoulder and pushed him forward. She pulled out her blood-stained sword, and the Magus's corpse fell backward. His unreconciled and empty eyes were still staring at the sky. He probably never dreamed that one day he would die at the hands of a mortal. The moment the wizard fell, the rebels on the city wall finally noticed the movement in this direction. The private soldiers cried out in alarm, and the knight in that direction immediately realized that something was wrong. They immediately directed several small teams to surround this direction. After Maynard stabbed the wizard to death, she knelt down as if she had lost all her strength. She knew that she had to run immediately, and the nearest reinforcements were far further away than the rebels. If she did not retreat, she could only close her eyes and wait for death. But she could not move a step no matter what. The previous explosion had already seriously injured her, and killing the Buga wizard had exhausted her last bit of strength. She could only watch as the rebel soldiers rushed towards her. Maynard could even clearly see the excited expression on the face of the soldier closest to her. He raised his spear and tried to stab her, but Maynard only gently moved to the side. Her left hand gripped the shaft of the spear, and she threw the sword in her hand forward with all her might. The sword pierced through the soldier's face. The soldier screamed in pain and fell on his back. The female knight switched the spear in her left hand to her right, knelt on the ground, and swept the soldiers in front of her to the ground. She was already an arrow at the end of its flight. She only wanted to buy a moment, either to be saved, or to die fighting. Maynard felt that she had no regrets in her heart. It was just that she could no longer see the ideal heroine that Guy had promised, and she could no longer see whether he had achieved all this out of his own ambition or out of faith. She really hoped that Her Royal Highness could live on and see all this for her. A knight finally rushed to the front. Maynard was slightly disdainful. These noble knights had long fallen. Many of them had inherited this identity from their fathers, but how many of them had the spirit and strength of the first generation of knights? Looking at the guy in front of her, he seemed to be fully armed, but his footsteps were light. At first glance, it was obvious that he had not undergone much systematic training. The female knight crossed the spear, and with a slight feint, she deceived the other party's attention. She pushed forward, and the spear directly pierced the armor on the other party's chest. The man groaned, probably not expecting to die in such a situation. He stared at Maynard in horror. The female knight's heart was as calm as a dry well. One. She thought in her heart. She was about to pull out the spear, but when she exerted her strength, she could not pull it out immediately. When she looked up, she was shocked to find that the descendant of the noble knight, whom she regarded as a playboy, was holding the spear that she had pierced into his chest, preventing her from pulling it out. Maynard's heart was suddenly alarmed. The guy in front of her did not seem to have such willpower. She had clearly pierced the other party's heart with her spear accurately. How could the other party still have the strength to do such a thing? She subconsciously let go of the spear, but it was still a little late. The long sword in the man's hand had already pierced through her chest. Warm blood flowed through the silver armor and flowed down along the wild grapevines and the silver lily leaves like a stream, gathering into the armor at his waist. Maynard opened her mouth slightly. She felt that the blood seemed to have poured into her lungs, causing her to cough violently. She felt the long sword being pulled out of her breastplate little by little, just like the flame of her life fading little by little. The world seemed to be gradually falling into darkness. In the last sight, the female knight saw her opponent pull the spear out of his chest lightly, without even a drop of blood. So this is the monster from Yenbao. Maynard felt herself falling into a deep sleep as her consciousness blurred. She fell heavily on the ground covered in rubble. Am I going to die? So this is the feeling of death. It's actually a little warm, she thought. Duke Grenoir's expression was like a vulture surveying its dying prey in the shadows. He watched the entire battlefield from the old plains to the Tegan Valley in the west of Menta. Flags of various colors could be seen faintly in the white world. The army spread out for more than 10 miles, and some of the flags were even hidden in the Menta forest in the east. Battles in the vast snow were relatively rare in the history of Wonde. The armies of the various lords were all hindered by the snow, and it was understandable that the private soldiers were unwilling to contribute in such cold weather. Overall, however, things were progressing smoothly. In fact, the Allied forces had secretly surrounded and outflanked Menta before the battle had even begun. Victory was only a matter of time. However, the key to this battle was not to defeat Menta's garrison. There were only a few patrolling cavalrymen and defenders, as well as a small number of White Lion guards. The key to this battle was to realize the arrangements of All for One, and lure the beautiful knight to Menta Castle. Everything seemed to be going well for now. Has Count Makarov's messenger arrived? No. Have you found out who the army in the south is? My lord, it should be the light cavalry from Schaflund. They retreated to Oboen after we repelled them. It's north of the silver mines. The Tonajal people have built a series of defensive systems there. The locals call it Valhalla. Chapter 1474. Humph, what a bluff. Have you detected the movements of the other armies nearby? Not yet, my lord. Any news from Sir Sar and Sir Cade, who attacked Fort Menta? Not very good, my lord. The attack has been thwarted. What's wrong? Duke Grinoelson's expression turned cold. According to Sir Sar, the opponents are very experienced and have a strong sense of resistance. They are fighting the two knights' armies in every street, and their progress is very slow. Moreover, the opponents have the help of the witches, and they can often take back the line of defense that we have already taken. Nonsense, a middle-aged noble beside Duke Grinoir said coldly before the Duke could speak. Count Tonajal's most elite White Lion guards and the cavemen have not left Abes. The ones left in Menta are only the local patrolling cavalry and guards. There is no experienced army. Humph, these selfish fellows only want to preserve their own strength. Upon hearing these words, Grand Duke Grinoires couldn't help but frown. Although he agreed with this statement, Sart and Sir Cade were his men, after all, and it was not Sar's turn to speak. He was just a despicable man who usurped his brother's position. If they did not have a common enemy, he would not even bother to associate with such people. The rumors about Yenbao also made Duke Grinoires fearful. He could not help but look back at the knight. His eyes fell on the knight's neck and cheeks, which were covered with silver and purple stripes. There were even pieces of fine crystal growing in some places. Duke Grinoires shuddered and took a step aside in disgust. What about the Buga wizards? The Duke asked, trying hard to calm his disgust. Are they not as good as the Tonajal witches? No. The knight was slightly hesitant. The Bugas seem to have lost a very high-ranking person. They are furious about it and are trying to find the murderer. Oh. Duke Grinoires was taken aback. He did not expect that there would be someone among the Tonajal who could kill a silver person. He could not help but be alarmed. He was glad that he did not get too close to the front lines. However, this also made the Duke frown. The strength of the Tonajal people was beyond his expectations. He originally thought that with the support of the Bugas, they should be able to easily take down their opponents, but whether it was in Randner or Lantan the attacks of the nobles were a slap to everyone's face. Lantan was now a swamp that trapped the Grey Mage and all for one, not to mention that Randner's White Lion guards were still stubbornly resisting, and the Count's deputy had yet to be captured. Even though Duke Grinoires did not say it out loud, he could vaguely sense that the Bugas behind him were becoming more and more restless with each passing day. He did not understand why, but the early start of the war against Trondheim was proof of it. This war should have only started after Randner and Lantan plan was fully implemented. When he thought of the Tonajal fleet that was said to have fought against the Empire, the elite White Lion guards, and the subterranean dwellers, he could not help but feel an indescribable uneasiness in his heart. This was the reason for his gloomy expression. Duke Grinoires could only hope that All for One's plan would succeed. Our soldiers saw that it was Lady Maynard who killed the wizard. Her. Duke Grinoires quickly asked, did the Bugas wizard catch her? The knight shook his head. Why, did she run away? Duke Grinoires was disappointed. No, according to the soldier's description, the lady seemed to have died in the battle, but our people did not retrieve her body. What? At this time, Count Yenbao could not help but interrupt him in surprise. Can you really prove that she's dead? Although Duke Grinoires was dissatisfied with the second interruption, the news still cheered him up. The female knight Maynard should be the person with the highest position in Abes from the royal family of Covardo. If she died, the Abes would be without a leader, and the following war could be decided in one fell swoop. Should be, the knight replied, we should have been able to retrieve her body, but there was a sudden change in the battlefield. Our soldiers were attacked by a druid and were forced to retreat. A druid? It seems to be the centaur warrior that Lord Makarov described in the Loop of Trade Winds, but it's a female. She can use some strange abilities to trap our attack. She seems to have a companion who can summon the animal companions of the druids to attack us. How can there be a female centaur, you idiot? Duke Grinoires replied with a frown. I know, it's a banshee. But I've never heard of a banshee in the forest becoming a druid. Does she really have an animal companion? No, my lord, those beasts were summoned by another person, the knight replied. Our soldiers saw it with their own eyes. She was also a woman, and she could command thousands of wolves to fight with us. Those seem to be male wolves from the Black Forest. Male wolves. Duke Grinoires frowned. Count Yenbao didn't seem to care. Don't worry, my lord. That count has some druid allies who also appeared in the Battle of Ampere Seal. But didn't Lord Makarov tell us that those druids aren't the servants of Count Tonajol? If things didn't work out, they wouldn't risk their lives to fight us. After all, the Black Forest is their homeland, and that land is worthless to us. We don't have any conflicts of interest. He spread his hands. This is great news. With Maynard dead, the Tonajol people collapsed without a fight. Their lord isn't here, and the Covardo royal family, which they are loyal to, can't even protect themselves. Now that the last remaining noble has died on the battlefield, we just have to announce this news and this war will end. Is that so? Duke Grinoires glanced at the disgusting man and replied, let's hope it's as you wish. Even though Duke Grinoires said so, he felt a little uneasy in his heart. It was not because he was worried that Trenthium's fleet would suddenly appear on the battlefield. Maynard's death meant that all for one's arrangement had taken effect, and Trentheim could no longer organize an effective attack. But there was a problem. Did they intentionally ignore another problem? The name that had been forgotten by everyone in the kingdom for a long time. He might have gone missing in the Cruz Empire, but was he really dead? Maybe it can't be that coincidental. The Duke couldn't help but shiver when he thought of this. It had been snowing for half a day, and there was no sign of it stopping. The forest on both sides of the river was mottled with white. The crown of the pine forest was covered with snow, and the river was still flowing. Occasionally, ice floes in the upper reaches of the river flowed down the river, mixed with dead branches and fallen leaves that were crushed by the snow, swirling through the middle of the river. Count, let me go to the front line with Roland. Since those treacherous bastards have already reached Tonajol, let us fight them to the death. With you here, we will definitely win. I will teach them a lesson. Young Montolo waved his fist and said. Behind the young man, Heinz and Claudia held hands and stood side by side. Young Montolo didn't find this strange. He didn't think that his father would agree to his elder brother's marriage, but according to his elder brother's temperament, even if he opposed it, it would be meaningless. He knew his elder brother's temperament very well. Otherwise, he wouldn't have such a bad reputation among the nobles. He knew in his heart that his elder brother's brain was much stronger than his own. It was just that he didn't care about the nobles' appearances and swordsmanship. He had a wide range of friends, and was more of a knight than a noble. But perhaps this was even better, as he would be the one to revive the Montolo family. Being loyal to the most outstanding lord of the kingdom, and as a true knight, reclaiming glory from the battlefield, bringing glory to the family, and reviving the Montolo family. This was the life he wanted. Brando glanced at the young men, Scarlet beside him, and Albert and the others of the Grey Wolves mercenaries standing not far away. Roland lowered his head slightly. Young Montolo's words made him feel uncomfortable. After all, before he made this decision, he had a lot of hesitation in his heart. After all, he used to be a part of the nobles' lineup. Although he took the sword from Brando's hands, after he calmed down, he had to carefully consider his position. Should he stand with his father and family? Or follow his heart's desire? But after a moment of hesitation, he still made a decision. Perhaps it was because of the passion in his heart that had not been extinguished, or because of a more rational and wise choice. But no matter what, after taking this step, he couldn't back down anymore. As for his father and family's position, Roland thought very clearly. Count Tonajul had no reason to lie to him. The Bugis were not telling the truth. They were just using the nobles of Erewhon. This early war showed a lot of problems. Although the nobles of Erewhon were now tied to the Bugis chariot, the problem was that the Bugis could leave at any time. It would be good if the rebellion succeeded, but if it failed, then the nobles of Erewhon would not be able to bear the burden. Chapter 1475. Roland could almost see what would happen if the nobles failed. How dare the Bugis murder Levin? He did not know if the nobles already knew about this, but no matter what, the outcome of this war would not end well. Duke Grenoires, who would bear the brunt of it, would no longer be able to enjoy the immunity of nobles. His fate might be even worse than Erech's. In order to leave a way out for his father and family, Roland could only hope that his choice was correct enough. But for some reason, he did not have too many doubts in his heart. He actually had a faint blind confidence in the victory of this war. Perhaps anyone who had witnessed the battle in the square of Abes would have such a kind of trust. Is this a joint decision of both of you? My lord, the rise and fall of the Montolo family and the Corvado royal family are intertwined. My brother is your knight, but I am a subject of the royal family. Even if you object, I, Claudia, will still rush to Menta from here. It's not a long journey. Haynes held his lover's hand and replied. Brando nodded. Compared to little Montolo, he actually admired this young man more. He had ideals and beliefs in his heart, and it was commendable that he was very clear-headed and understood what Erewhon needed. A new kingdom was built by ideals, but what maintained its existence was still new interests. He glanced at Roland again. My lord, I have already thought about it, Roland replied. I only hope that you can forgive my father. The one who can forgive your father is not me, but himself. If he did not make too big of a mistake, he would not have received such a groundless punishment. Brando replied, but everyone has to be responsible for their own choices. Even Duke Grenoires is no exception. Roland understood the meaning of this sentence and nodded silently. Brando turned around and said to Uriel, who was not far away, Tonajul has now entered a state of war. You will lead these people to Valhalla. I authorize you and Scarlet to mobilize Valhalla's army. Julian nodded. Ever since Carglass was promoted to the position of vice commander of the White Lion Guards, the former knight captain had taken over Carglass's original role, assisting Yuta in the defense of Abes and training the new recruits with Coden. Originally, he should have taken a lot of responsibility for the attack on Yuta. Fortunately, the Lord didn't blame him and instead gave him an even more important task, which made him feel flattered. However, he also understood that this was the time when the territory was in dire need of manpower. The critical situation was comparable to the First Tonajul War. If he couldn't earn an eye-catching performance in the upcoming battle to make up for his mistakes, he was afraid that his future would come to an end. Thinking of this, Julian couldn't help but feel his blood boil as he replied, My lord, leave it to me and Miss Scarlet. But what about the defense of Abes? Lady Yuta is still unconscious, should we leave it to Cornelius? Brando shook his head. I'm afraid Cornelius doesn't have a clue about the defense of Abes. I've already ordered Vern, who was stationed in Schaflund, to return to Abes. As for the defense of Schaflund, leave it to Coden for the time being. My lord, then you. It's faster for me to go to Maxon alone. Julian was stunned. Although the journey from Gar's ferry to Maxon was short, it would take at least a few hours. Wouldn't it be much more efficient to return to Valhalla and use the airship to teleport? Although the airship fleet had to protect the safety of Valhalla and couldn't be fully mobilized, it wouldn't be a problem to mobilize a sub-fleet. In his memory, although his lord had the strength of an elemental awakened, even an elemental awakened powerhouse wouldn't be as efficient as an ordinary person. They couldn't possibly run all the way, and even if they did, they would only be slightly faster than the horses used to deliver messages. "Do you need horses, my lord?" Julian hurriedly asked. Gar's ferry should have some spare warhorses. Brando shook his head and made a gesture, interrupting Julian's words. It was at this moment that he suddenly heard a voice in his mind. "Heavens, it really is you, my lord." Monique's voice trembled with joy. "You're finally back. What's wrong? Did something happen, Monica?" Brando frowned. He didn't expect Valhalla's telepathy to have expanded to such a large range. When he left Tonajol, he could only sense Monique's telepathy within the range of the world tree's trunk. However, he could faintly hear a trace of anxiety in Monique's surprised tone. "It's like this, my lord. I took the initiative to mobilize Valhalla's mana pool to expand the range of my telepathy. I originally wanted to inform Lady Yuta and the cave dweller leader Tajiv." Speak slowly. Brando saw that Monique's tone was hurried and had a tendency to be long-winded, so he quickly interrupted her. "Get to the point. Something happened to Lady Maynard." As she spoke, the light spirit, Monica, told him about the life gemstone in an urgent tone. Brando's heart tightened. He already knew that something might have happened to Paris in the north, so even though he rushed here without stopping after settling the matter in Hades, he didn't expect that he would still be a step too late. Brando also knew that the main personality in Maynard's body was Baijia. With her skills and calmness, if something happened to her, it definitely wouldn't be a small matter. He couldn't help but feel anxious when he thought of this. He didn't have time to ask about the princess and Freya, and hurriedly spoke in his mind. "Monique, listen carefully. Since you can contact this side, can you immediately send a fleet from Valhalla to Menta?" "I'm afraid I can't, my lord." Why? Monique's voice was a little hesitant. "Tamar and I have used up all of Valhalla's mana. I'm afraid that the fleet won't be able to be mobilized in a short period of time. There was still some left, but I used up the last bit." She thought for a moment and hurriedly added in a small voice, This is something that Lady Maynard agreed to." Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized something, and said angrily, "Could it be that the world tree is starting to level up again? Why now? Allium Japonicum. Even Lady Maynard allowed you to do as you please." "And no," Monique replied incoherently, "but it's more or less the same." "All right." Brando shook his head, and did not want to continue arguing with her. Moreover, even if he scolded the poor light elf now, it would be useless, and it would only be a waste of time. "Monique, let's not talk about this for now. How many troops are there in Valhalla that can be mobilized?" "My lord, the troops in Valhalla can be mobilized at any time. Other than the White Lion Guards, Lady Maynard did not mobilize any other troops." Monique's voice was obviously more confident when she mentioned this. She thought for a moment, and replied, "Actually, there's another problem that I need to report to you, my lord." "What is it?" "Oh, that's why I'm looking for Lady Yuta and the leader of Tajiv. I need authority, my lord." "Authority?" "Yes, you know that I don't have the authority to command Valhalla in battle. I need authority. Brando was stunned. "Wait, Monique, don't you have the authority to mobilize the troops in Valhalla at any time?" No. Monique shook her head like a rattledrum. "I'm talking about commanding Valhalla in battle, not the troops in Valhalla." "Commanding Valhalla in battle." Brando suddenly understood what she meant, and said in surprise, "Wait, Monique, you're saying that Valhalla itself can be used in battle? But I remember that this isn't an ability that only a level 6 fortress has. Has Valhalla already grown to this level?" "It's still far from that, my lord." Monique shook her head, but as the world tree, Valhalla is known as a fortress with life. Its specialty is its ability to move. Tamar, Lady Maynard, and I have thought of a way to recreate the world tree's spirit, and at least it can move. Monique paused for a moment. My lord, I can think of a way to communicate with the world tree's spirit and have her move Valhalla to the battlefield, but that requires you or Lady Maynard's authority. After all, you are the master of the world tree. Brando was overjoyed when he heard this, and he immediately said, Of course, Monique, I order you to immediately go to Maxon's territory to provide support. No matter what, you have to ensure Lady Maynard's safety, understood? Monique patted her chest confidently. Leave it to me, my lord. Monique won't let you down. This will be Valhalla's first battle in this world, and I guarantee that everyone will be shocked by it. However, she immediately asked, My lord, do you need to return to Valhalla first? I can bring you along with me. How long do you need to prepare for the teleportation? Brando asked. Less than half an hour. Brando shook his head. There's no need. Some people here will reach Valhalla in half an hour. You can bring them along to the battlefield. He paused for a moment. As for me, I'll only arrive earlier than you, Monique. Impossible. Monique was still in disbelief, but she soon let out a cry of surprise. Ah, Martha above, my lord, your strength. Brando smiled faintly and ignored the little girl. He turned around and looked at the others present. Then, everyone, I'll see you in Maxon. Scarlet opened her mouth slightly, and was about to say something when she suddenly saw her lord rise into the air, turning into a silver light that shot towards Maxon's direction. Gaspard watched this scene with his mouth agape. He knew that elemental realm powerhouses could fly for a short period of time, but no one had ever told him that an elemental realm existence could fly so quickly. Even the legendary fastest creature in the world, the elemental wind dragon of the Mountain of Quelled Storms, probably didn't have such speed. He couldn't help but think as he looked at the silver light. Chapter 1476. Brando flew along the Gars River towards Mente. Beneath his feet was the vast western forest of Schaflund. From the air, the dark forest of late winter mixed with the dazzling white of snow made it seem as if the world was being covered in silver. This forest was not a remote place. In fact, it was the main road that connected Mente, Orte, Paris, and Schaflund to Abes. There were scattered manors and villages in the forest, and the occasional hunter's hut could be seen in the forest. However, most of them were already deserted. The aura of war condensed in the sky above Tonajol. Seeing this scene, Brando's heart was calm. The construction of Abes was the culmination of many people's hard work. Amandina and the Romans spent years to turn this barren land into a prosperous place for business. But compared to the difficulty of construction, destruction often took only a short moment. Erewin's nobles were not only unable to guide the kingdom forward, but also became the root of its progress. The royal faction in his memory had long since ceased to exist. Her Royal Highness hoped that the people could regain the faith of the late king, but in the end, it was only a bubble. This was not all good. Erewin had returned to the mortal world, and its heroes had even decided the tragic fate of the kingdom. This experience of starting all over again told him that everything in history was not a coincidence. Everyone involved, including himself, had pushed the course of history, and set it on a path of no return. But he did not feel anger. Or rather, his cold emotions suppressed his anger. What he needed was no longer anger, but a thorough cleansing. He understood that everyone could have done many wrong things, and he was no exception. Neither he nor Princess Griffin could decide all of this. But since the nobles had chosen their own fate, then they must have expected the outcome of failure. At that moment, Brando understood that an era had passed, and the Erewin he was familiar with would also be gone forever. He had completely unfolded his web of laws, and the power of the sage shrouded the world. It was an aura that was close to that of a god, but it had fused with the origin of this world. This was the power of existence. It was supreme, but it existed everywhere, and no one could detect it. When everyone was searching for the ultimate power, they did not know that they were already in it. That was the power of the entire world. In Brando's eyes, the sky above the forest formed a large net that constantly moved closer to the center. It was no longer made of continuous space, but nodes. When he passed through these nodes, the scene on the ground seemed to automatically shrink from far to near to him. To an outsider, it was a point in the sky that continuously leaped forward, forming a straight silver line, like a meteor streaking across the sky, heading towards Fort Menta. Da'ad. Meteor. In the depths of the forest, a young man dressed in wolf skin pointed to the sky and shouted excitedly. Behind him, the middle-aged man with a frown on his face gave him a knock on the head. How can there be a shooting star in broad daylight? Hurry up. But it's real. The youth said, holding his head in grievance. The hunter looked up at the sky. Even in the gloomy snowy sky, the sky above Menta Forest was spotless. There was nothing in the sky. Thick clouds piled up on the horizon, and only palm-sized snowflakes drifted down. He sighed, this cursed weather. Is Lady Martha blind to let the good suffer and the wicked enjoy? I thought Tonajel would have a moment of peace, but these damned nobles want to take away the last hope of us refugees. Those nobles are the most despicable. They only dare to do this when the Count is not around. If the Count comes back, they'll be taught a lesson. The youth said childishly. His father, however, did not care. That was just wishful thinking. The nobles stood high and looked far ahead. If they dared to make a move, then they must have absolute confidence. Perhaps the Count was already dead. At the very least, even if the nobles lost, they would only be punished and have to pay for their sins. The king also needed the lords to rule his country. If the princess killed all these people, who would work for her? Would she choose talents from the commoners? How could there be any talents among the commoners? They were illiterate. Even he did not believe that he could stand shoulder to shoulder with the nobles, let alone rule this country. The nobles were always in cahoots. What could the Count change? He alone could not challenge the entire world of nobles in Erewhon. The older hunter had long passed the age of hot-bloodedness, and there were even some who looked down on the locals of Trentheim. The locals would boast about their lord as if he was a god in order to gain some pitiful vanity. He had seen it many times. In Brugloss, in Ranner, where were the citizens who were not like this? Of course, the Count might really have some powerful aspects, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to turn the tide in Ampere Seal. But to say that he could make the Kurlutzians bow their heads and gain the favor of the high and mighty silver folk was a bit too much of an exaggeration. Even Marshal Darius could not do such a thing. How could his descendants do it? Each generation was worse than the last. The nobles fought for nothing more than for the purpose of fighting for power and profit. This time, the nobles banded together to deal with the Count of Tonajel because he stood on the wrong side. He had long heard that the Count was secretly drooling over the Princess Beauty, and could not help but shake his head inwardly. Heroes have a weakness for the charms of beauties, but that did not necessarily mean that he was a hero. Even he could see that the Covardo royal family was already on the verge of collapse, and the Count was so stubborn and foolish. He could not help but shake his head, hating himself for being blind and believing the nonsense of his fellow countrymen. He chose to move from Manaville to this place. He should have known that this was a place of trouble and chose to go to the north of Viro. If not for the fact that he was worried that those hateful skeletons would go north. The resentment in his heart turned into physical action. He kicked his half-grown sons but scolded him with the authority of a parent, "Stop talking nonsense and hurry up and leave. If you fall into the hands of those damn rebels, you'll be in for it." Logically speaking, his son should have been obedient after he kicked him like that. But he didn't expect that this time, the youth seemed to have become stupid. He didn't know that his butt had been hit, and he stood there in a daze without moving. "What are you standing there for?" the elder hunter snapped. "Are you waiting for death?" Who would have thought that his son would turn a deaf ear and stare straight ahead as if he had lost his soul? The elder hunter grew up in the forest. Although he was more familiar with the forests north of Manorville and Bragg's, he had been exposed to the legends of the mountain people since he was young. Naturally, he knew that other than prey in the mountains, there were also some creepy places. In the north of Bragg's, the forests there had been developed by the locals for thousands of years. Even the most remote places had hunter huts. Even so, there were still rumors of hunters encountering strange things. Every year, a few people would go missing, let alone in a remote place like Tonajol. He felt his hair stand on end and instinctively reached out to his son, pulling him back by the shoulder as he shouted, "What are you looking at? Get your ass back here." At the same time, he also looked in that direction. With one look, the father and son were stunned on the spot. It was a chaotic scene in the tree hole. The screams of the light spirits rose and fell one after another. Energy conversion to 86. 77. 65. 40. 33. 11%. Warp complete. Rematerializing. Valhalla taking root. Recalculating coordinates, Valhalla, be careful. Monique suddenly screamed. "Ah!" There was a panicked cry. The Odin stronghold is going to turn incorporeal again. Recalculate the coordinates of the 7th and 8th roots. Rematerialization complete. Mana consumption is over the limit. Warning, the 7th root's mana engine is overheating. The light spirit screamed in panic. "That's the prototype that Miss Amandina provided. We're dead if it breaks. We're dead. Run." "Shut up, you idiots." Monique was fed up with her brainless companions. "That's not what we need to worry about right now. Inject the coolant," she shouted. Coolant injection complete. Temperature dropping. Mana estimated to be depleted in 20 seconds. Countdown commencing. 20, 19, 10, 9. The 8th root has taken root. The 7th root has taken root. Odin Fortress is rematerializing. Cutting off mana output, Valhalla warp complete. Cooldown commencing. Recharge estimated to be completed in 15 minutes. The tall white-clothed girl finished her report in a flat tone, but her face was a little red. It was obvious that the previous dangerous scene was not completely without impact on her. She then closed her eyes to check the status of the fortress. After confirming that there were no errors, she said, "The fortress is in good condition. There are no abnormalities." Monica collapsed in front of the control panel under the crystal tower like a puddle of soft mud. The other light spirits in the hall also let out a sound of relief. Then, they all fell to the ground one after another like drunken flies, as if they had just survived a disaster. Chapter 1477. Are the two of them all right? Sifrid looked at the radiant spirits with a puzzled expression. She blinked her large green eyes and asked in a soft voice, "What are you doing?" "Those two damned bastards." Monique jumped up from the ground and screamed in anger. But she quickly remembered that the radiant spirits were not at fault and returned to the ground. They're not dead yet. It's fortunate that Valhalla reacted quickly, or else the 8th root would have crushed them into dust and become nutrients for Yggdrasil. Sifrid was a little worried. Valhalla's teleportation is too dangerous. We're still in the middle of a deserted forest. If we teleport to a densely populated area, won't there be a lot of casualties? Is there really no way to avoid it? How did the gods deal with it in the past? Monica blushed. In fact, the materialization process of Valhalla was quite safe. She could check the situation on the other side of the warp point before the coordinates were confirmed. However, in order to save mana, she let Valhalla skip this step. The reason was that it was impossible for anyone to be in the Mentai Forest right now. Valhalla's mana pool is still too small. It only takes a normal person a few hours to travel from Shaflund Hills to here, but we actually had to teleport twice in a row. It took more than half an hour just to recharge the mana pool. If we had 12 mana pools, we could have teleported from Tonajul to Cruz in one go, and we wouldn't have to shut down the other mana-consuming facilities in Yggdrasil. There's nothing we can do about it, Sifrid smiled bitterly. My lord has invested a lot in this fortress, but we don't have enough time. You're right. It's all those damned Sassold's fault. In Monique's eyes, the local nobles in Erewhon were completely ignored. They were no match for Valhalla, and at best, they were just annoying flies. She turned around and asked, Valhalla, have you finished calculating the coordinates? Where is this place? According to the map you provided, Miss Monica, we should be about 70 kilometers south of Fort Menta. The town of Orda is not far from here. According to our battle plan, we should send a support team here. Monica thought for a moment before replying, very well, let Gaslil go. It should be enough to arrange for the White Lion Guards to stay here. Sifrid hesitated for a moment before she spoke up, I want to see those two people. They might be frightened to death. What's there to see? Monica replied snappily. However, she glanced at the little girl and shrugged. All right, it's up to you. We still have a lot of time anyway. When the huge root swept towards him, the middle-aged hunter thought he was dead for sure. Who would have thought that at the critical moment, the root would suddenly change direction, missing him by a hair's breadth and crashing to the ground amidst the creaking sounds of trees collapsing. It took a long time for the dust to settle, and the surroundings became quiet once more. The father and son tremblingly opened their eyes again. When they looked ahead, they couldn't help but subconsciously hold their breaths and widen their eyes. In the forest, the dense hazel forest and pine forest disappeared, and an unimaginable thing appeared out of thin air. To be exact, it was an even bigger tree. Its trunk was like a mountain peak that pierced through the clouds. Its vast canopy covered the entire forest, and its slender branches and lush green canopy were shrouded in the clouds. A few birds were flying around the giant tree, and from afar, they looked like a swarm of flying insects. The giant tree's huge roots wrapped around the undulating mountain range, forming a natural outer wall. On top of the outer wall, there were tall man-made buildings. But the thick stone walls were filled with the simple style of the dwarves, and they were even taller and more majestic than the fortresses they had seen in Manorville and Ranner. The father and son looked at the scene with their mouths agape. If they were not dreaming, they must have gone mad to see such a strange scene. The two could not help but think of the myths and legends that were widely spread in the south. It was said that on a sunny summer afternoon, the forest would show the illusion of giant stone statues and the city where the giants lived. Although it was not a sunny afternoon, nor was it a hot summer day, the father and son were almost certain that this was where the giants lived. They couldn't help but tremble in fear. According to legend, the giants were monsters that ate people in the wilderness. Although the stone giants that could build cities were said to be gentle, they probably wouldn't have any good feelings for two insignificant mortals like them. However, they didn't dare to rashly escape. The roots of this huge city extended for several miles. How could they easily escape from its range? While the two of them were worrying, a human head suddenly popped out from the towering city wall and looked in their direction. Although the other party was wearing a sentry helmet, the distinctive features of the huge nose, small eyes, and thick beard all indicated the identity of the other party, a dwarf. To be precise, he was a rune dwarf who claimed to be a descendant of the Silver Folk. If you use such a simple title to call Odin, the dwarven master craftsman would definitely correct your faulty wording and add a bunch of adjectives to modify it. Of course, he would also add a bunch of other related and complicated titles to address Odin. For example, he was the only master craftsman in Valhalla, advisor to the count, scholar, archaeologist, and so on. Of course, most of them were self-titled. Odin squinted his eyes for a long time before he saw the two insignificant fellows below Valhalla. It was not that his eyesight was bad, but the noise in the city had distracted him. Even though Monique had sent a notice to all of Valhalla before Valhalla's teleportation was activated, everyone knew the standards of the light spirits. It was already a miracle that they did not make any mistakes. It was almost impossible for them to do a good job. The old dwarf could not help but think of the little girl he met in Schaflund. That cute little girl was said to be the Lord's fiancée. Even though the merchant girl was muddle-headed when it came to doing things, she was always able to arrange everything in an orderly manner when she was in the territory. There was no way her subordinates could not understand her intentions. Of course, there was also Amandina and Miss Maynold. If any of them were still in the territory, Valhalla would not be in this state. When the light spirits suddenly told the citizens of Valhalla to enter a state of battle, even if they were loyal to their lord, it was inevitable that they would fall into a state of panic and unease. I really don't know what these fellows are doing. Odin grumbled to himself. He then placed his hand on the battlements and shouted at the two pitiful creatures who were already trembling in fear, "Hey, are you all right?" The father and son hunters did not expect that a dwarf would appear in a city of giants. Weren't these two races irreconcilable enemies? It was said that a long time ago, during the war with the Twilight Dragon, the giants betrayed their dwarven allies in an important battle. Since then, they had lost their own civilization and degenerated into filthy, smelly, man-eating monsters that never bathed in the wilderness. After that, the dwarves swore to break off their relationship with the giants, and the giants became mortal enemies. Could it be that this city of giants had been taken over by their enemies and became a city of dwarves? The middle-aged hunter had this ridiculous thought, but no matter what, dealing with dwarves was better than dealing with giants. With great difficulty, he finally calmed down the uneasiness in his heart. With reverence, he looked at the towering giant tree and fortress that suddenly appeared in the forest. He swallowed his saliva and was thinking about how he should answer or how to make the other party let him and his son leave. Suddenly, he heard his son exclaim in surprise. "Oh my God, I understand now. This must be Valhalla Fortress. You must be the legendary dwarven craftsman who designed and built this fortress, Mr. Odin." The young man's eyes shone brightly as he looked at Odin, who was standing on top of the city walls. "I'm also an advisor to the count, a scholar, an archaeologist, and a master alchemist," Odin added in dissatisfaction. "Kid, I'm also an advisor to the royal family, but I didn't accept it. The Erewhon Geographical Association also invited me to become an honorary member, but I declined." "It's really you." "Of course." Odin proudly puffed out his chest, but he quickly remembered that he had other matters to attend to and waved his hand. "All right, it's good that you're fine. Now, please step back a little. I'm going to put down the gate." "Gate?" The father and son looked at each other. However, they immediately understood the true meaning of this sentence. The roots of the towering tree suddenly wriggled and extended from the stone wall that was originally tightly attached to it, as if a huge suspension bridge had been lowered. However, the size of this suspension bridge was a little shocking. Each of them spanned a distance of over 1,000 meters, and they were wide enough for carriages to pass through. The father and son hurriedly retreated, and soon they saw a flag on the towering city wall. It was the flag of Aween's royal family, the star, moon, and lily flag. Then there was another flag, a flag of a white lion fluttering in the strong northern wind. A few knights holding flags took the lead and rushed down the city wall. Behind them were rows of knights in bright armor. They had silver heavy armor, enchanted capes and small shields, long white manes fluttering on their pointed helmets, and lion heads on their shoulder plates. All of these indicated the identity of this army. The White Lion Guards. Chapter 1478. Dad, look. Those are the White Lion Guards. The young man was trembling with excitement. I heard that they are Count Tonnagil's personal night guards. The middle-aged hunter had a strange expression on his face. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he did not. He could only stare blankly at the White Lion Guards marching down the huge vines that extended to the ground in an orderly manner. Throughout the entire process, there was no other sound other than the dull and uniform sound of their metal gauntlets. No one was whispering to each other, and there were none of the nobles' private soldiers or even night guards that they had seen in other places. Almost everyone walked past them without looking at them. There was no unnecessary eye contact, but the middle-aged hunter felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen Braggs's Southern Legion in Manorville before. Those night guards were considered elite. It was said that during the First War of the Black Roses, they had fought against the skeletons of Madara more than once. Compared to the private soldiers of the nobles who were defeated by the undead, they were considered elites. It was said that the Southern Legion had also stood against Count Tonnagil in the war led by Duke Grenoires. He was not optimistic about the Count's future. No matter how powerful he was, how many private soldiers and night guards could he have? But now, he could not think of any of these thoughts. He only felt a chill run down his spine, as if he was sweating profusely. When Gaspard rode past the hunters on his horse, he did not think that they would have such complicated thoughts. He did not even look at them. There were too many hunters like them in the Menta Forest. He was just a little surprised that they were still here at this time of the year. For the past 2 weeks, most of the residents in this direction had been evacuated by Yuta to the north and west of Abes. However, that was all he had in mind. Facing the chilly northern wind, he pulled down his metal mask, leaving only a pair of sparkling eyes exposed. Gaspard let out a long breath. The hot breath immediately turned into mist when it met with the cold, forming a thin white mist outside of his mask. He watched as the snowflakes fell on his metal armor and disappeared. He knew that this was another expedition of the White Lion Guards. But whether it was for himself or for the kingdom, this battle might have an unusual meaning. The backbone of the White Lion Guards Knight had a vague premonition that perhaps from this moment on, the future of the kingdom would take a path that no one had ever imagined. Countless people had been moving forward on this path, but they had lost their way. But at this moment, the fog had dissipated, and they had finally taken a step forward. In this slight sense of unreality, Gaspard seemed to have seen another future. In that future, the kingdom was struggling and burning in flames. Countless living beings were crying and screaming. He couldn't help but shudder. At the same time, he returned to reality. Gaspard looked back at his subordinates. Most of the soldiers of the White Lion Guards were actually of the same age as him. Many of them even came from this land. As for him, he was just one step ahead of these people. Participating in the Battle of Ampere Seal was perhaps the greatest pride of his life, but this pride would continue today. The knight drew his sword and pointed it forward, letting out a deep roar from his throat. White Lion Guards, advance! It took the hunter and his son a while to recover from their shock. The White Lion Guards had long disappeared into the forest, and the young man was still restless, as if he had not had enough. But his father had already sensed the danger. Such a military mobilization was not a small matter, and they had witnessed it with their own eyes, and this strange fortress. The middle-aged hunter even trembled a little. He held his son's shoulder in fear, afraid that he would be killed by the enemy immediately. The dwarf had already run down from the vines. Odin had once vowed to build an impenetrable fortress, and the minimum requirement for such a fortress was that it did not have a gate. Although this design was criticized by Amandina, it was fortunate that Valhalla's unique power made this ridiculous design a reality. Its gate was now replaced by the roots and vines of the World Tree, and achieved unexpected results in terms of defense. Of course, the old dwarf took the credit for this lucky hit as his own. The hunter was scared half to death by a fully armed dwarf with a battle axe in hand. He almost collapsed to the ground. He hurriedly pulled his son to the ground and knelt, begging, "No, my lord, please don't kill us. We didn't see anything, and I promise we won't say a word. Or at least, please let my child go. He's still young and doesn't know anything." His action startled Odin, and the dwarf glared at him. "Martha above, what nonsense are you talking about? Who wants to kill you? Valhalla is about to teleport, and you can't stay here. Just as well, there's a lord who wants to see you. Count yourself lucky, come with me to the city." "What? Can we enter Valhalla Fortress?" The young man was originally uneasy, but he was still a young man after all. When he heard the dwarf's words, he could not help but stand up excitedly. "Are you serious, Mr. Odin?" "Of course." The dwarf thought for a moment and added, "I'm the one in charge here." Brando quickly saw the town of Orda in the forest from the sky. This town was just a few miles south of Fort Menta. If the rebels had already launched an attack on Fort Menta, they would definitely not let this place go. As expected, there was a small-scale battle taking place in the town below. The two sides were engaged in a tug-of-war around the center of the town. The rebels had clearly entered the town. Brando could clearly see the two sides fighting. The ones in charge of defending the town were a group of White Lion Knights, while the attackers were dressed in all sorts of robes and carried the banner of Grimoires. It seemed like they were the army of the nobles of the southern border. The attackers outnumbered the defenders by several times, but the White Lion Knights did not back down. They were able to repel the waves of attacks from their opponents several times. But soon, the figure of a wizard appeared in front of the rebel army. He wore a blue robe and was a Cisaldian illusionist. Brando knew that the young White Lion Knights were more than enough to deal with a noble knight, but they were unable to retaliate in front of these craftsmen and fell from the sky. Tower illusionists were grade 7 soldiers in the game. They were much stronger than the White Lion Knights that he had personally trained. As soon as he landed, he attracted the attention of the rebels. The Buga wizards had their own means of communication, so they were naturally extra vigilant against this unfamiliar intruder. Under their orders, a dozen rebel knights immediately surrounded him, followed by a large group of attendants and private soldiers. Brando did not even look at them. He walked forward and passed through the central square of Orda. His arrogance had obviously angered these bloodthirsty noble knights. They roared and rushed over, waving their swords in an attempt to teach this ungrateful fellow a lesson. But Brando simply pulled out the holy sword Odorfice. When the first knight and his warhorse galloped to his side, Brando raised his sword to block. The man's arm holding the sword flew out, and then he knelt on the ground with his horse. The knight on the saddle was bound by the stirrup, but he still flew off the horse's back and landed heavily on the ground. The 100-pound armor crushed his spine. Brando continued to move forward, and the knight charging towards him was torn apart like broken puppets. They either lost their heads but still charged forward with their warhorses, or were directly split in half. It seemed like it was just a blink of an eye, and more than a dozen noble knights were all dead. For Brando, this level of battle was not worth mentioning. At this moment, even if he returned to Lushta, he could easily defeat the supreme powers of Cruz and the others. After returning to the modern world from the realm of stagnation, his biggest gain was a new understanding of the laws of this world. When he realized that all of this was a legacy from the previous era, the latent power in his bloodline seemed to have awakened. The power of law was no longer hazy to him like a cloud of fog, but the true truth. That power was so strong that sometimes it even gave him the illusion that he was drifting away from this world. He felt like he was a god. Although he was clearly in the modern world, he felt like he was overlooking everything from the clouds. There was a sense of distance between him and the continent of Wound. And the people around him felt it even more clearly, especially the people of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Other than the previous feelings of gratitude and worship towards this lord, there was also a deep sense of awe. According to Hain's words, walking beside the Count was like accompanying a giant dragon. Every breath it took made one tremble with fear. Brando also felt the same way. He could feel the assimilation of this world. This was the instinctive closeness of the laws of Tiamat to the power of existence. He had experienced this feeling in the Amber Sword, but at that time, it was not as clear as now. The battle with the noble knight was not even comparable to the time he used to kill low-level monsters in the novice area. Even though the continuous short-distance jumps had consumed a lot of his power of order, it was still too easy to deal with these people. Chapter 1479. He did not even need to use the power of the law. Just by relying on his swordsmanship, he could make these people understand why he was the youngest sword saint in the kingdom. It's a sword saint. The noble knights finally came to their senses and began to retreat as their legs turned to jelly. They were not fools and naturally understood the real gap between them and a sword saint. There were only a few sword saints in the Great Erewhon, and there were many noble knights like them who were just waiting to die. As soon as the knight fled, the attendants, who had no combat power, naturally could not stand still and began to retreat. When they reunited, they were a mess, but when they retreated in an orderly manner like the tide, looking very experienced. Some of the veterans were said to have escaped from the First War of the Black Rose until now. Those who were lucky enough to survive the repeated defeats of the war were not good at attacking, but they must be masters at retreating. The illusionists in the tower also realized that something was wrong at the front line. A wizard of Sarsard, who heard the news, came down from the sky and stopped in front of Brando. This silver person looked down at Brendel with a reserved and proud expression. A mortal sword saint was considered a figure in the mortal world, but in front of the silver person, he was nothing. There were also sword saints among the Nashi who served the Sassolds and the Shakhtar Knights. However, he was slightly surprised that the other party was so young. A mortal genius, he said, among these insignificant insects, you can be considered a relatively outstanding existence. Unfortunately, you shouldn't have appeared in this place. The wizard raised his staff and pointed at Brando. Sir, be careful, they are silver people. A voice warned. Brando looked in that direction, and the Knight of the White Lion Guards also noticed the situation here. Brando's appearance took a lot of pressure off them, so they had time to warn him. However, the commander of the Knight of the White Lion Guards did not recognize Brando's identity and only thought that he was a sword saint of the royal family. Brando did not point this out. He stretched out his hand and used the same trick again. The staff in the wizard's hand flew out of his hand and landed firmly in his hand after a beautiful arc. The wizard was angry that his identity was exposed, so he used his silver lightning to stab at the commander of the knight. However, when the staff flew out of his hand, the lightning miraculously flew in a circle in the air and then came to Brando's hand. Brando held the lightning tightly. The lightning twisted and swayed in his hand like a struggling electric snake, making a buzzing sound and splashing platinum sparks, but it was unable to break free. So this is the power you're so proud of, Sarsard. Reckless, angry, blind, and arrogant. Is this what the knowledge you obtained from the White Tower tells you? Brendel looked at the Sarsard magus who was casting the spell. Is this the power you're so proud of, Sarsard? You, the wizard was so scared that he was incoherent, and his face was no longer as confident as before. Brando looked at him as if he was looking at a dead man. He was extremely calm, and the calmer he was, the stronger his contempt for the Sassard alliance became. There had never been a silver person or a gold person who was so despicable. Go to hell and repent. Martha will prepare a place for you there. Brando loosened his hand, and the lightning flew out of his hand, flying towards its original owner at a speed 1,000 times faster than before. In the wizard's horrified eyes, the lightning pierced through his magic shield like a straight javelin. All the magic shields on his body were shattered in an instant, and the lightning penetrated his chest. He screamed and turned into a piece of charcoal, falling to the ground. Those who indulge in power will die because of it. The wisdom you obtained from the White Tower did not tell you this. Even an outsider like me understands the reason why the Silver people are arrogant, Brando said indifferently. That is because they are excellent and dare to take responsibility. How can you compare to those noble people? The remaining illusionists were so frightened that they stopped in their tracks. The highest of the supreme, the wizards at the back were like birds startled by the twang of a bow. They turned around and fled. For a moment, the periphery of the forest flashed with the brilliance of magic. In just a moment, not a single Sasard wizard could be seen on the battlefield. Brando did not pay attention to these people. Even the Bugis had retreated without a fight, and the remaining rebels did not dare to continue staying in the town of Orta. Orta was one of the most important roads to Menta, and if they could control it, they would be able to cut off the retreat of the Trendheim garrison in Menta Castle. However, everyone knew that they had to be alive to control this place. Besides, victory or defeat was Duke Grenoir's business. They just wanted a piece of the pie, and it was not worthwhile to die for others. Therefore, no one needed to command them. In less than a quarter of an hour, these people had all fled. Brando crossed the square and walked towards the commander of the White Lion Guards. He was bathed in blood and had many wounds on his body. There was also a broken arrow stuck in his right leg. Looking at the smooth cut on the arrow shaft, he must have cut it himself. He came to Brando with the help of several other knights and bowed to Brando. It was the most noble etiquette. Obviously, the captain of the night finally recognized Brando's identity. There were far more corpses of the rebels in the square than the White Lion Guards. Brando realized that his strict requirements for these young people and the high investment in the Tonajal territory had finally paid off. The White Lion Guards had become the seeds of a powerful army in the future of Erewhon. As long as they took root and sprouted, it was not impossible for the kingdom to have a military force as strong as the Cruz people. However, this army must be in the hands of people who had the ambition to revive the kingdom. Many people did not realize what had happened, but through word of mouth, the White Lion Guards who were guarding Orta finally understood the reason for the sudden end of the battle. There were more and more people in the square, and the young people of the White Lion Guards who were heavily injured came closer. My lord. The captain of the night was so excited that he almost could not control himself. He knelt on one knee in front of Brando. His action was like a signal, and all the young people on the battlefield knelt down one by one. Brando helped him up. I'm back. As you can see, he replied. The craftsmen of Sasard have despicably laid their hands on a mortal kingdom. The blood of the Silver Clan is no longer noble because of their despicable actions. You don't have to worry about Erewhon perishing because from this day onwards, from this moment onwards, we will make them pay with their blood. Those who have committed crimes will pay the price for their actions. I assure you. My lord. The captain of the night asked excitedly. Are we going to launch a counterattack now? Has our fleet arrived? Where are they? Brando looked at him and at everyone present. They were all young faces, and some were even younger than him. They were the faces of teenagers, covered in dust and blood, but their eyes shone with hope for the future. That hope was the love for this kingdom, for the homeland of the Erewhon people. There was no Erewhon people who were born inferior to others. This kingdom was the same. Their lord had proven this more than once in Ampere Seal and the Black Sword Fortress. If he could do it, so could they. Where we are, and behind us is Valhalla. Brando stretched out his hand, and a flag of stars, moon and lily automatically flew into his hand. The counterattack has already begun. If you want to share this glory with me, pick up this flag and return to the battlefield with me." Every knight raised the long sword in their hands. Their swords were the answer in their hearts. The fortress was shaking, and dust was falling from the ceiling. Reto leaned on the perforation with a cold face, watching the situation outside. His men were good, and once again repelled the enemy's attack. Those damned rebels retreated in a hurry after leaving a ground full of corpses. They even gave up a tower that they had previously occupied. However, the former mercenary known as the Red Copper Dragon did not look relaxed at all. Instead, he looked serious and dignified. Although the rebels' fighting spirit was shockingly poor, their advantage in military strength could not be ignored. In just a few hours of repeated fighting, the White Lion Guards and Menta's defenders had also lost a lot of men. Such a loss of men was undoubtedly one disaster after another for their already stretched military strength. In order to make up for the lack of military strength, they had to constantly shrink their positions. However, the depth of Menta Fortress was always limited, and Reto knew that there would be a time when they would have nowhere to retreat to. Within his field of vision, many of the walls and fortresses had already raised the flags that represented the nobles of the southern region. The flags of the White Lion Guards and the Stars, Moon and Lily, fell from his field of vision one by one. He could not help but close his eyes tiredly. This was already the last fortress that led to Menta Fortress. The city hall and the patrolling cavalry camp could not be lost, or they would completely lose the initiative in this battle. However, hope was already so slim. Maynard told him that Valhalla would soon notice the abnormality here and mobilize troops to support them, but it would take at least half a day to get here from Schaflund. Could they still fight for even 2 more hours? Chapter 1480. Have you found Lady Maynard? Reto asked in a tired voice when he opened his eyes again. The continuous battles made the veteran of the November War feel a little unbearable. After all, he was already old and no longer as brave as he used to be. The people in the room shook their heads in silence. Most of them had experienced the war for many years. As the lucky survivors of the war, almost every one of them was a warrior who had experienced hundreds of battles. The last time we saw Lady Maynard was at the north of Fort Menta. After the rebel army captured the place, a wizard blocked our way, and then the rebel army cut off our communication with the North Gate. Is there still a battle at the North Gate? The rebel army has surrounded the place. Have you tried to attack? We have, but the rebel army has invested a lot of troops there. We don't have enough people, boss. The fact that the rebel army is so concerned about this place means that Lady Maynard might still be alive. We must find a way to save her. Reto knocked on the dusty table and set the tone. Almost everyone in the room was his old friends, so he did not hold back when he spoke. But everyone in the room looked troubled. If the situation allowed, they would certainly save the commander at all costs. However, they did not even have enough troops to defend Fort Menta, so how could they send more people to support other places? Lady Knight is Her Highness' subordinate, but Fort Menta is His Highness' property. We are His Highness' retainers. Are we really going to give up this fortress for her? A voice in the corner asked weakly. Reto looked in that direction and shook his head. Guys, he said, do you really think that His Highness values Tonajol? Can't you see that His Highness is ambitious? Not to mention Tonajol and Abes, I'm afraid that even Erwin is not in His Highness' eyes. Think about it. If His Lordship had accepted the invitation of the female Legion Commander Cruz and joined the Empire, how could his status be compared to that of the Count of Tonajol? What did he do in Erwin? He brought us here from Brags and overthrew the rule of that damned Baron Grodin and his lackeys. Why? Reto looked at his old companions one by one. Haven't you noticed? The Lord never asked us to swear allegiance to him because he didn't want to become another Grand Duke Erek. I've heard him talking to Her Highness and Miss Amandina in private. I think what they want is what we've been longing for since the long years of war. A real heroine who is not controlled by others, who stands above wound. My companions, he said softly, we were born in Brags, but Tonajul is indeed our second home. Compared to that, we have another identity in common. Don't forget that we are heroine soldiers. At this time, we should abandon our selfish interests. We are the Count's subordinates, and we should stand up to prove his righteousness. Redo pointed at the battlefield outside the perforation and replied, if each of us spread the Count's beliefs to the whole of Erewhon, our ideals, the Count's and Her Highness' ideals will be realized. The room was silent. Can we do something like that? Yes, it's too troublesome. It's a headache just hearing it. Boss, are you sure it's something we can do? That's something only the officials and nobles need to worry about, right? But boss, when did you become so scholarly? Ha! The laughter seemed to be contagious, and soon everyone in the room also laughed softly. Redo shook his head with a smile and scolded, shut up, you damn idiots. I used to be a noble knight, like Mano, who used to be my attendant. Following you vulgar fellows, I've even lost my old profession. Okay, stop talking nonsense. You are right, we are the Count's retainers, but since we are the Count's retainers, we have to carry out the Count's will. So, Miss Maynold, you have to save her even if you don't want to. Although everyone was joking on the surface, no one dared to oppose Redo's decision. People left the room in an orderly manner and began to gather their subordinates. It was as if they had returned to decades ago. It was nothing more than a battle. For the veterans, it was as natural as eating and drinking. You're awake. When Maynold woke up from her drowsy state, she saw a familiar face. It was a beautiful girl. She had a pair of bright, narrow eyes. When she squinted, her pupils were as black as ink. The girl's skin was inhumanly white and as delicate as jade. She had long, black sandalwood hair that reflected light like the stars in the night sky. However, Maynold's attention was attracted by the black gemstone on the girl's forehead. It was a long, narrow, diamond-shaped black crystal. The girl's face turned red with anger. She followed the female knight's gaze and recalled the humiliation she felt when she got the gemstone on her forehead. She snorted coldly. Ko Hua. Maynold was shocked by her own hoarse voice. She remembered what happened in Rushta and hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Where is this place? Did Menta fall? Am I your captive now? After you left Rushta, did you seek refuge with the Bugis? Or are they really in cahoots with the Twilight Dragon? I haven't fallen to the same level as those Cisaldians, Black Corfa replied with a hint of anger. You're such a hateful woman, just like that guy. Don't mortals have any sense of shame? I'm the one who saved your life. You're back. Maynold was stunned. Thank you. There was a sharp whistling sound outside. The catapult stone shells hit somewhere not far away. The house shook and dust fell. Maynold silently sensed for a moment before asking, so this place is still Menta. How long have I been unconscious? Are Mr. Redo and the others still resisting? Miss Ko Hua, can you take me to the city hall? I'd advise you not to entertain such delusions, and I have no obligation to serve you, Black Corfus snapped. You're only alive because of sheer luck. If it wasn't for this guy, even if I arrived in time, you would have been dead by now. Maynold then noticed that there was a young man behind Ko Hua. When she saw him, she couldn't help but be stunned. That was because he was the second son of Oberway, the young knight who left Menta Castle early in the morning to scout for information. The young man noticed Maynold's expression and hurriedly stood up, saying somewhat anxiously, Miss Maynold, I know you're suspecting me and my father, but I can assure you that my father would never betray Her Highness. There must be something else going on. He hesitated for a moment, then gritted his teeth and replied, I can guarantee it with my life. Maynard rubbed her aching forehead, finally recalling everything that had happened before she fainted. At that time, she had almost thought that she had died at the hands of that monster. However, it seemed that many things had happened after she fainted. Shouldn't I be dead? Maynard subconsciously touched the wound on her chest. The sword wound was still there, almost piercing through her chest and abdomen. That sword should have pierced through her heart. You should indeed be dead. This piercing wound pierced through your heart. To any mortal, this is the most fatal injury. Black Ko-hwa paused. But the strange thing is that you're still alive. Don't ask me why, because I don't know either. Perhaps it was your Lady Martha who saved your life. Maynard was silent for a moment. There was a vague feeling in her heart that she could not grasp, but she could not say it out loud. In addition, it was this guy who risked his life to save you from those monsters, Black Ko-hwa continued, otherwise, I wouldn't have the ability to do so. Those monsters are the fangs and claws of the Twilight Dragon. We call them the No Race. Other than the Goddess of War's unique imprinted weapon, no one can really kill them. Now even the No Race has reappeared. I really don't know why Mother thinks so highly of you. It's just a small human kingdom. Whether it's the Sawsalts or the fangs of the Twilight Dragon, you can't deal with them. Maynard sighed and said to the young man, I can believe you, but you can't guarantee for your father. In any case, Mr. Oberway has an unshirkable responsibility for everything that happened here. No, the young man shook his head, Miss Maynard, something may have happened to my father. What? Since Her Royal Highness and Prince Haruz left Tonajal, my father has sent me letters every week. On the one hand, it's to let me know the situation in Randner and Lantern Island, and on the other hand, it's to keep in touch. However, I haven't received a letter from my father for more than a week. At first, I didn't think anything was wrong, but I didn't expect something like this to happen. The young man was a little annoyed and replied with some worry, It's all my fault, Miss Maynard. If I had been vigilant earlier, maybe this wouldn't have happened. My father. Chapter 1481. Maynard shook her head. She faintly felt that what the young man said might be true. She was also willing to believe that Oberway would not betray the princess. But there was no point in talking about this now. The worst-case scenario had already happened. What they needed to do now was to find a way to prevent the worst outcome. Miss Ko-hwa, she replied weakly, can you contact Valhalla? Me? Dark Ko-hwa sneered and shook her head, of course not. What do you think the situation is now, human woman? We have been surrounded in this place to save you. Of course, the mortals outside can't stop me, but I don't dare to act rashly. Otherwise, the Sisaldians and the No Race will notice my presence, and then we will all die. She paused for a moment, although I promised my mother to come and help you, I don't want to die with you. Maynard was silent. Of course, she could not ask the other party to die with Erwin. After all, she knew what the other party's true identity was. Sister, a voice came from outside the house, they are attacking again. Maynard recognized the voice as Ko-hwa's. Although the two sisters' voices were similar, the younger one's voice was far less cold than Dark Ko-hwa's. She gritted her teeth and sat up. Although Ko-hwa said that it was best for her not to move, the knight was more concerned about the battle in Mintai than her own injuries. If this fortress could not hold on until Valhalla reacted, then Erwin would be doomed eternally. At this moment, she even forgot who the owner of this territory was, and also forgot the unpleasant experience she had with Brando. She only felt anxious in her heart. She tried to stand up with the help of the wall while anxiously calling out the name of Allium Japonicum in her heart. She had never liked her other self. If she could, she would never compromise with her other self. But at this moment, she had no other choice. However, the call in her heart was like a stone thrown into the sea. This made Maynard's heart sink deeply. She even felt a sense of panic. She found that she had gotten used to having the mature and rational other self by her side as her advisor. If the other self was really gone, she did not know how to face Erwin alone. What made her even more afraid was that she did not know how to face Brando. Dark Ko-hwa only watched Maynard's actions indifferently. He did not even take half a step forward to help her. The young man seemed to want to step forward, but he was stopped by the night. Maynard held onto the wall and walked out of the house. The sudden brightness caused her to squint her eyes involuntarily. She found that she was still near the north gate. Her knight subordinates had already retreated to the sluice gate on the northwest side of Fort Mente, using the terrain here to continue sniping at the rebels. The sounds of battle seemed to have returned to her ears at this moment. She saw the youths of the White Lion Guards, Menta's defenders, and a portion of the patrolling cavalry entangling with the rebels, not giving an inch of ground to them. However, the number of enemies was beyond her imagination. The private soldiers of the nobles, dressed in gray and blue robes, surged forward like a tide of two different colors. They were repelled time and time again, but they surged forward again and again. Their will to fight was unexpectedly strong. It seemed like the enemy had already realized that she was here. Otherwise, they would not be so enthusiastic about a mere sluice gate. Several magi floated in the sky, and the light of spells once again intertwined on the city walls. Though the enemy's numbers were small, the witches were far from being a match for these magi of Sasard. The occasional explosion from the city walls was enough to prove this point. In fact, they were only barely able to protect themselves and prevent the front line from being defeated. Maynard maintained a calm expression as she silently searched for the flag of Count Yenbao's territory. She had a deep impression of those monsters, and knew that the White Lion Guards were no match for them. However, the Tanajul people were still defending this place, so where did they go? What are you looking for? Dark Ko-hwa asked from behind her. Where are those monsters? They were lured away by her. Otherwise, do you think we would still be here? Her. A strange woman. I think she's one of Kelsey's subordinates. I remember seeing her before, but she's a little different from before. Maynard realized that she did not know that Dark Ko-hwa mentioned. She was silent for a moment, and could see that the situation was worse than what Dark Ko-hwa had said. She could not help but ask in a low voice, "What do you plan to do, Miss Ko-hwa?" Dark Ko-hwa glanced at her. "I will follow my mother's orders and help you resist until the last moment. After that, I will choose to leave this place. You can only pray that those little fellows in Valhalla will be able to react before then." She paused for a moment, "But for that guy's sake, I can take you with me." "No," Maynard shook her head, "I don't need it. Up to you, but I have to tell you that even though there are still some troops in this city, don't expect the Tanajul people to come and save you. Don't forget that the White Lion Guards and Menta's troops are that guy's troops, but he is not your lord." "What are you trying to say?" Maynard's eyebrows twitched slightly. "You understand." Maynard gently pressed her hand to her chest and gritted her teeth. She knew that if that person was here, he would definitely come and save her. However, it wasn't because of her, but because of the other soul in her body. Furthermore, that person wasn't here, and his subordinates didn't know about this secret at all. Reto was an outstanding soldier, but the more outstanding a soldier was, the more they understood who they should listen to. Would they risk everything to save an outsider? The female knight didn't have any thoughts of begging for her life. She only felt a wave of sorrow and despair, because this was Erwin, this was this ancient kingdom. No matter how much that person did, the one to benefit would never be Erwin, unless he became Erwin's lord one day. But if that happened, he would no longer be a hero of the kingdom, a loyal knight. After the layers of glory faded away, only the title of a usurper would remain. That person would be nothing more than another Erech. How could they bring hope to the kingdom's future? Perhaps even if the other party wasn't so despicable, what was the use of that? Everyone around him, including his assistant, all had the same thought. Were they really loyal to Erwin's kingdom? They were loyal to Tonajol, to Valhalla, to that person himself. The Cisaldian wizards finally broke through the witches' line of defense, and the White Lion guards, who had suffered heavy losses, began to retreat. Although it hadn't turned into a complete rout, they had lost their last line of defense. Dim Corfo let out a low growl. Black smoke surged around her, forming into the shape of giant wolves. These huge wolves charged towards the battlefield, but the only thing they could do was slightly impede the advance of the rebel army. "We have to retreat," Miss Maynold, Oberway's second son, whispered beside her. Dark Kohua also turned around and said with some anger, "I can't hold on for too long. The Cisaldians will soon notice this side. You'd better quickly consider my previous suggestion." However, Maynold turned a deaf ear to him. She stared blankly at the defeated battlefield in front of her. Everyone was retreating, and the flag of the White Lion Guards was falling from the horizon. The Dragon Knight of the Southern Legion flew in the sky, as well as the wizards in grey robes, interweaving spells. This scene seemed to overlap with her memory. She remembered that it was the gloomy sky of Ampere Seal, and she and the young Wangli Knight regiment had nowhere to run. But this time, would such a miracle happen again? Would a person turn the situation around with the power of one person? However, the female knight couldn't see a trace of hope in her heart. Even if there was, could he really save Erwin? How can Erwin be saved? Maynold muttered to herself. Allium Japonicum, tell me, you didn't lie to me. Everything you saw in the future is real. Tell me, you can really save everything. You and that guy aren't working together to deceive me, right? You despicable woman, tell me. I can give you everything I have, even my life. Because rather than letting me return to that terrifying future I saw in my dream, I would rather die right now. She coughed violently because of her wound. The young man next to her wanted to help her, but he was flung away. Maynold coughed so much that she even shed tears. She slid down the wall, but the voice in her heart didn't respond to her anymore. The young man stood aside at a loss. He had never seen this cold Miss Knight show such a weak side. She was sobbing, but he didn't dare to take a step forward. He stared blankly at the scene in front of him. There was a voice in his heart telling him that Erwin was finished. What he saw would be the last moment of this kingdom. He seemed to have seen such a future. Everything that he had seen in the past was burning fiercely in the flames, turning into ashes. From then on, people forgot their names and their former identities. The ancient name Erwin disappeared in the long river of history. It wasn't until decades later that a girl picked up the dusty flag again. It was the lily flag of the stars and the moon. He looked up, as if he was hallucinating. He really saw the flag. It wasn't the lion flag of the White Lion Guards, nor was it the AB's flag that could be seen everywhere in Tonajol. Chapter 1482. Instead, it was the bright moon, the slender stars, the pure lilies, and the silver flag fluttering in the wind. A wave of cheers suddenly erupted from the battlefield. The young man shuddered and subconsciously rubbed his eyes, finally realizing that he wasn't hallucinating. He truly saw the flag that belonged to the royal family of Corvado. Reinforcements. Maynold stood up abruptly. The female knight's tears were still wet as she looked in that direction in astonishment. Behind the sea of rebels surrounding the fortress, a few streets away, flags of stars, moon, and lilies were being erected. But where were those troops from? The Royal Knight Regiment? Or the White Lion Regiment? Which direction did they come from? How was this possible? Maynard's mind was also in a mess. This female knight, who had always been calm, felt her heart in a mess for the first time. She didn't understand who it was that had come to this place at this moment. But the thunderous cheers on the battlefield answered her question. It was the reinforcements from Maxon City. Maynard saw the copper dragon Reto at the front, as well as the veterans of the November War beside him. The flag in their hands was not the war flag of Tonajol or Abes. It was the symbol of the kingdom. The flag of the royal family of Corvado. At that moment, the female knight understood what they were trying to say. Today, here. We have forgotten the estrangement between us, our allegiance to different factions. We will die as Erewhon soldiers. And all our faith will be placed on this flag. From now on, this kingdom will be reborn from the ashes of the flames. At that moment, Maynard suddenly understood Brando's faint smile, the undisguised confidence in the eyes of the Allium Japonicum, the blind trust the princess had in everything here, and the fear in the hearts of the traditional nobles of Erewhon. She also understood why every Tonajol was filled with hope for the future of the kingdom. Because they were here. To witness all of this happening. She stood there in a daze, subconsciously clenching her teeth. Her body even began to tremble uncontrollably. Tears once again gushed out, but only her fists were still tightly clenched. Miss Maynard, it seems to be Mr. Reto and the others. But they don't have many people, why would they come here? The young man suddenly stopped talking. He saw the female knight looking back at him and snatching the sword from his hand. Maynard slowly unsheathed her sword and raised it high. She faced the entire battlefield and all the White Lion knights on the battlefield. She shouted at the top of her lungs, "Today. We might not win. But Erewhon won't fail either. Those who fear everything will eventually suffer the consequences of their own actions. Let us once again fight for Erewhon, and let this ancient kingdom rise from our bones. Because before today, it has never existed. But after today, we will be proud of our identity as Erewhon's people." The knights all turned their heads around. When they saw Maynard, they all raised their swords. Fight for Erewhon. It was an oath to abandon everything. Dark Kohwa turned around and looked at the panting Maynard disapprovingly. You can't win. The level of morale won't determine the outcome of this battle. Your enemy is thousands of times stronger than you. You should understand that your reinforcements are just some remnants. So what? Maynard smiled and then coughed twice. She replied weakly, but we can't lose. They can kill us, but they can't kill Erewhon. So he really didn't lie to me and Her Highness, so he really didn't lie to me. The knight gently pressed the sword wound on her chest. Miss Allium Japonicum, are you still alive? What a bunch of fools. Seeing this, Duke Grenoires cursed in a low voice. Count Manuel, Baron Chablis, the enemy only has a few hundred people. We have already wasted a few hours here. Can't you take down a mere sluice gate? His face was so gloomy that it looked like water was about to drip from his face. My lord, the enemy's druids are too powerful, and the reinforcements from Fort Maxon are also very troublesome. They are experienced in dealing with wizards. With the buildings in Fort Maxon as their cover, the Bugis lords can't do anything to them. At most, they can hinder their attack. Unless my lord agrees with the Bugis lords to use magic to raise this fort to the ground. That's what the Bugis wizard said. Shut up, Duke Grenoires waved his hand as if he was shooing away flies. Our goal is not this Fort Maxon. There are still the subterranean dwellers and that terrifying fleet in the south. Do you want to alarm them? Go, continue the attack. Your opponents seem to be the survivors of the November War, but their numbers are not large. I'll give you 1 more hour. This is your last chance. After driving away the 2 nobles, the Duke of Grenoires' face became gloomier. The uneasiness in his heart grew even stronger. They had been in Fort Mind for more than 6 hours. They thought that it was just a small fortress that could be easily taken down, but it had held them back for such a long time. And this was under the condition that they had made all the arrangements in advance. In the south, there was Valhalla's fleet, as well as the main forces of the subterranean dwellers and the White Lion Guards. If the Tonajol were prepared in advance, then it would be a bitter and difficult battle. However, Duke Gringoire did not want to burn this place to the ground. To be precise, he did not want to lose too much of his strength. He knew very well that after this battle, if the nobles in the south won, the kingdom would at least regress by a few decades and return to the chaotic situation before the age of prosperity. And the best-case scenario would be to return to the situation before the Battle of Ampere-Seal. Duke Gringoire did not have any feelings about the future of the kingdom or the fate of others. What he cared about was that in such an environment, the strength at hand was the only weight that could guarantee his position. Although the Buga people said that they would stay behind to maintain order in Erewhon after the war, it was hard to say whether they would continue to cooperate with him. He knew very well the intentions of the Buga people. They would not take Erewhon seriously. If the previous promise could be fulfilled, it was already beyond his best expectations. But it did not matter. They were using each other anyway. He also needed the strength of these silver folk to fight against the rapidly expanding royal family of Covardo and these Tonajol people. It turned out that at least he had taken the right step. If it were not for these Buga people, they would not be a match for the Tonajol people at all. The Duke of Gringoire was shocked by this. He really could not understand how the Tonajol people could be so brave and good at fighting. In the past, he had never heard of this place being full of brave warriors. In fact, Tonajol had always been on the periphery of the kingdom's political scene. The knight here had never won any glory on any battlefield. But since the arrival of the descendants of the Sword Saint Darius, everything had changed. Could it be that the bloodline of the Cataloso family was so powerful? It had the power to turn something rotten into something magical. What was even more puzzling was that these people seemed to have a fanatical loyalty. Even if the Count of Tonajol was not here, they would still be willing to risk their lives for their lord. This made the Duke of Gringoire furious. Looking at his cowardly and selfish retainers, he felt that his dignity as a noble was being insulted. Not to mention that even the druids were working for that guy. He had never heard of these mystics living in the forest paying any attention to the nobles of the outside world. They even rejected the invitation of the Cruz Empire, but they favored a mere young boy. With this thought in mind, the Duke of Gringoire angrily spread out the map and once again confirmed the situation of the war. Although the rebel offensive had suffered a setback in Fort Menta, at least in Orta and Cape Gap, the progress was smooth. Baron Paladono, the feudal lord of the south of Viro and a former member of the royal faction who was known for his prowess in battle, had led his knights to conquer the town of Tegan, north of Fort Menta. Now, they were heading straight for Gar's ferry from the direction of Cape Gorge, cutting off Menta's retreat route. On the other hand, his trusted aide, the Redbud Count, was traversing through the forests to the east of Alerte. They had set out from Paulus to attack Schaflund, and when the encirclement of Fort Mentai was complete, they would coordinate with the Bugis to launch an all-out assault on the so-called undefeatable fortress of Trenheim. This was also the most important point of attack. 2 experienced knight lords and their squires were in charge of covering the left and right flanks. This army had conquered several villages and manors to the north of Schaflund 3 hours ago. It could be considered a series of victories. Although there had been no news since they entered Greyhill Valley, the Duke of Gringoire was not surprised. Before the general attack, this army should be in a state of silence. They still had the Wyvern Knight of the Southern Legion to guard the sky, so he did not think that this army would have any problems. On the battlefield of Fort Macht, the main forces of Count Yen Bao and the southern army of Gringoire were gathered. There were also 7 or 8 brave and skilled nobles. The total number of troops was more than 20,000, which was almost 10 times the number of the defenders of Fort Macht. There was also the support of the Buga sorcerers. Although they may have been delayed for some time, as long as the other two armies did not encounter any problems, victory was still within their grasp. Everything was under control, but the Duke of Grenoires could not help but feel a sense of trepidation. He silently observed the terrain around Fort Minty on the map. He couldn't help but wonder from which direction the enemy would attack from if possible. Chapter 1483. The terrain around Fort Mintel was not complicated. To its north was the open old plains. The old river and the Pardon River had washed out the sedimentary belt of the plains. The long and narrow valley plains in the north were affected by the ever-changing forces of chaos, forming the barren Pardon wilderness. It was almost a flat land, which was very suitable for an army to spread out. To the east and south of Fort Mintel was a large forest located between Mintel, Paris and Schaflund. This vast forest was called the East Mintel Forest. There were 2 roads through the middle of this forest that connected to Fort Mintel. One of the roads went through Gars Ferry, while the other was connected to the only satellite town south of Fort Mintel, Orda. Duke Grenoires reached out and pointed at the town on the map. The Tonagel people were resisting fiercely here. The person who commanded the attack was the deputy commander of the Northern Noble Alliance last time, Marquis Balta's deputy. He was also a very famous knight commander in the White Lion Legion. The Tonagel people who were stationed here defended the town for nearly half an hour and did not allow the noble commander to take the town. It was said that the White Lion Knight Regiment was formed by the son of the Blade Master himself. It was said that the White Lion Knight Regiment was formed by the son of the Blade Master, and it was indeed worthy of its reputation. However, he had already asked the Buga wizards to go and support them. Although there was no news yet, he was sure that it would be done soon. After all, there were no witches or detestable druids there. After cutting off Fort Mintel's escape route, one of his worries had been relieved. In any case, this large-scale plan was more than half completed. But things often went against one's wishes. Just as Duke Grenoires put down the map in his hand, a noble knight rushed to him and shouted in panic, "My lord, we have lost contact with Orda." What happened? The Duke's heart skipped a beat. The uneasy feeling in his heart seemed to be confirmed at this moment. He quickly asked, "I'm not sure, my lord." The first news was that a blade master belonging to the royal family appeared in Orda. Not long after, our communication with that direction was cut off. Sword Saint. Grenoires was trying to figure out which of the sword saints loyal to the royal family of Covardo would suddenly appear in this place. However, one sword saint was nothing to worry about. How could a single sword saint affect the entire battle? In the end, it would only be the northern nobles' army that would be at a disadvantage. However, to be on the safe side, he still asked, "Have you sent scouts to confirm the situation?" "It's been dispatched." "Which of our troops is the closest to Orda?" "I'm not sure, but it seems like the army from Blackwater Bay captured a village called Emden." "Oh, that's Baron Gorham and his knight." Duke Grenoires nodded and said, "Let them go to Orda and send a cavalry unit from the 3rd column of the Southern Legion there." "Understood, sir." Duke Grenoires watched his knight leave. He rolled up the map and put it into the map box beside him. He could not help but sigh, closed his eyes, and rubbed his forehead. It was not his first time on the battlefield. For the past half a century, Erewhon had been at war almost every day. Between the nobles, the people of Erewhon, and the undead of Madara, large and small battles took place every month in this ancient kingdom. He first went to the battlefield with the old Duke Grenoires at the age of 14, and was already a qualified military noble at the age of 16. He had even participated in the Second Holy War. Although he hadn't experienced the most dangerous battles, he had more or less experienced. He could be considered a veteran of hundreds of battles. Duke Grimoires knew very well that in a war, not everything would go according to plan. Only those who had not really commanded a battle would naively think that the war was going according to plan. Whoever had a better plan would win. But the truth was far from that. For those who were familiar with war, a real war was more like a great adventure that depended on luck. Especially in a huge battlefield like this, which was more than 10 kilometers deep, both sides involved in the war were almost blind. The side that had control of the sky and the strength of the wizards might have a better plan, but the inefficient command and the speed of the army's response would make the original plan full of loopholes. When it came to the battlefield, it was not so much a competition of who had a better plan, but who had better luck and fewer mistakes. If one side in a battle made an unforgivable low-level mistake, then the balance of the war would often tilt because of it. And this kind of mistake was often unavoidable. Sometimes, both sides of a war would repeatedly make multiple mistakes, and in the end, it would become the will of Lady Martha to decide the victory of the battle. For now, although there were more or less unexpected situations on the battlefield, such as the situation with Orda, they were still within an acceptable range. The Bugha's plan was very clever. Except for the part where the executors were the southern nobles, the other parts of the plan were perfectly reproduced. Everything was going well, but Duke Grimoires still felt uneasy. He felt that he had missed something. He opened his eyes again with some annoyance, stood up from the table, and paced back and forth. He admired the Bugha's efficient execution. It was said that the White Lion Guards commanded by the descendants of Darius had shown such a standard, but Duke Grimoires scoffed at it. At least in the current battle, the other side did not show such a standard, although their individual tactical accomplishments and strength were indeed far superior to their peers in Erwin's country. The difference between the two was so obvious, so where did his worry come from? Duke Grimoires himself could not figure it out. He walked back to the table, picked up his pipe, and seemed to be ready to light it up. But in his irritation, he really did not have the patience to complete the delicate work of filling the pipe and lighting the fire, so he put the pipe down again. Then he heard footsteps outside the tent, and knew that the knight he had sent out had finally returned. The Duke finally could not hold back the uneasiness in his heart. He lifted the curtain of the tent and asked anxiously, "What's wrong? Did you find out what happened in Orda's direction?" He suddenly stopped talking. He saw his knight standing in front of him with a pale face and a crushed helmet in his hands, trembling. The pitch-black helmet looked like a common knight's helmet in the southern territory, and it was stained with blood. "What's wrong?" Duke Grinoelson's face was calm. His deep-set hazel eyes were fixed on the helmet. "My lord. Baron Gorham, what happened to him?" "The Baron, he has died for his country, and his knight. This is the news sent back by the Bugha wizards. What's going on here?" The Duke suppressed the anger in his voice and asked in a deep voice, "Aren't they north of Orda? Did they attack without my orders?" The knight's Adam's apple bobbed, and he could not say a word. "What happened to Orda?" "My lord, Orda has been taken back by the Tonajol, and no one escaped. The Tonajol launched a counterattack, and they have passed Emden. Gorham and his men are all cavalrymen. Why didn't any of them escape?" Although Duke Grimoires was not angry yet, his calm tone was enough to silence his knights. They trembled as they handed over the helmet in their hands and replied, "I'm sorry, but I'm sorry. My lord, this is the relic of Baron Gorham that the Bugha brought back." Duke Grimoires waved the knight's helmet away in annoyance. The bloody helmet fell to the ground and rolled a few times before stopping. He finally said angrily, "Why do I need this damn thing? Oh right, where are the Bugha? Didn't they make it in time?" The knight almost buried his head in the ground. "My lord, the Bugha wizards have also suffered losses. They are gathering their men to encircle the Tonajol." "Very well. How much longer do they need?" "This, I knew it. These damned bastards are unreliable." Duke Grimoires turned and walked back into the tent. He angrily swept the things on the table to the ground, making a series of clanking noises. Tell me. How big is the Tonajal army? What is their composition? Where did they get into our encirclement? How many wizards do they have? Where is their direction of attack? My lord. The knight hesitated. We still don't know who they are. Some people say they are the White Lion guards that were originally stationed in Orda, but we don't know where they got into our encirclement from. They don't seem to have wizards. They don't have wizards. That's nonsense. Duke Grinoire said angrily, if they don't have wizards, how could they wipe out Baron Gorham and his knight squires? How could they let the Bugas suffer so much? Did this army come from Shaflund? That's not it, my lord, the knight immediately replied. Shaflund is still peaceful. Our men stationed in that direction haven't encountered any problems. We'll contact them every 5 minutes. Very well, Duke Grinoire sighed. What about this army? They left Orda and attacked Emden. Where are they going next? Fort Maxon. Tegan. Chapter 1484. My lord, the knight replied awkwardly. The last news came from the scouts of the Southern Legion's second column who were resting at the north of Emden. We have a total of 50 light cavalrymen there. They had returned to Fort Menta to rest after completing their mission to scout the direction of Shaflund. Very well. Tell me what they found. The last news they sent back was that the army was moving towards Paris. Paris? Duke Grinoelson gasped. They're going to attack Welland Ferry. What are they trying to do? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to kill me? He was so angry that his beard and hair stood on end, and he almost repeated this sentence several times. The poor knight could not help but tremble when he saw the blue veins on his usually elegant and calm lord's forehead clearly visible, as if he was about to swallow someone whole. Duke Grinoires took a few deep breaths. The Ord River flowed through Fort Menta and turned south to flow into Shaflund's territory. Furthermore, Welland Ferry was located on the southern shore of the river near the East Minte Forest. Trenthium's attack in that direction was obviously not to support Fort Minte, nor to threaten Tegan, which was further north. It was because they were going in the opposite direction. The enemy clearly had only one goal, and that was to attack the main camp of the Noble Alliance between Paris and Menta. This was an audacious act that did not respect the Duke at all. But after Duke Grinoire said this, he suddenly realized something. He stopped and asked, "You said this is the last message from the scouts?" Yes, because the Bugas sorcerers saw from the sky that these poor scouts had been defeated, and in fact, not a single one of them escaped from that battle. The poor young knight could not help but look at the blood-stained helmet on the ground. "Unless I'm crazy," the Duke of Grinoires repeated, "unless I'm crazy, I won't believe it. But tell me what happened. If a wizard saw it all, then he must know what happened. Why did an entire squadron of light cavalry not make it out alive? Did Orda have an entire legion of Trenthium's troops stationed there before? Or did they have an archmage among them? By the way, you mentioned that damned Blade Master to me. Are you going to tell me that he's a supreme Blade Master?" "My lord," the knight replied in a trembling voice. "My lord, the wizard said that the poor scouts all committed suicide." Enough, are you kidding me?" "My lord, I'm telling the truth." The wizard was also terrified. He saw it with his own eyes, and he wanted me to tell you that the Blade Master was indeed a supreme Blade Master. He seems to have mastered a domain that can make people hallucinate. Well, that's why the Bugas called for their friends. My noble gentlemen are also afraid." Duke Grinoires was so angry that he laughed. He could not help but swear. A supreme Blade Master who has mastered a domain related to illusions. There's no such person in Erewhon. All right, that's enough. He waved his hand. Let me calm down. Get out of here. When I think about it, I'll tell you what to do. Now there's a damned madman here who wants to lead a group of outlaws to take my head. Let him come, I'll wait for him here. My lord, get out. The knight retreated from the tent in a panic. After a while, rustling sounds could be heard from outside the tent. Duke Grenoires looked up and saw a man lift the curtain of the tent and walk in. He narrowed his eyes and saw that the man was the usurper from Yenbao. Seeing this man, Duke Grenoires was reminded of his damned agreement with the Bugis. This is the agreement between you and these damned Bugis. He could not help but mock. Looks like you're very angry, my lord. The man laughed. Is this my negligence that caused our allies to fall into such a situation? Shut your stinking mouth, usurper. This mess is your plan. Now you're telling me that the Covardo royal family has a supreme blade master who has mastered illusions. A supreme blade master. Duke Grenoires said with a dark expression. Even in the Holy War, the empires did not send out such a powerful person. Do you really understand what that means? Look at those damned Bugis, they're already pissing their pants in fear. Hearing the title of usurper, the man's face turned gloomy, but he still smiled. They're just some apprentices. The real powerful wizard Sassard is not here. You have to believe in the strength of our allies. I believe in your strength, but that doesn't mean I'll be kept in the dark. Duke Grenoires said angrily. He pulled out his sword and placed it on the man's neck. If you intend to use my men as cannon fodder, I'll make you regret it. A cold light flashed in the man's eyes, but he did not show any fear. He only reached out and pushed the sword away. Looks like you're scared out of your wits. My lord Duke, he's just a supreme blade master. If he wants to die here, then let him. Just a supreme blade master? Duke Grenoires looked at the man in front of him strangely. Are you all crazy? Just one Mephisto is enough to make the Cruz Empire suffer. He was only a quasi-supreme blade master when he became famous. The Holy Cathedral of Fire only has a few supreme blade masters like him. The great saint of the Holy Cathedral of Fire is already a sage, the man replied. Besides, it's not like Erwin didn't have such a powerful person, but that was decades ago. He looked into Duke Grenoires' eyes. All right, I'll find a way to win your trust, my lord. Trust is earned through action, and that's understandable. How about you let my army deal with this supreme blade master? Duke Grenoires looked at the man suspiciously. If possible, he did not want to believe a single word that came out of the man's mouth. But the situation was obviously not up to him. Although I think you're courting death, that's your choice. I won't stop you. If you're in trouble, you'd better not come to me. He replied, also, I think you'd better find a way to make the Bugis move faster. I'd rather trust them than you. Of course I'll need the help of the wizards, but if it's just to stop those arrogant people, it won't be so troublesome. Count Yenbao sneered. My lord, you just have to wait here for my good news. I hope it's not your head that's sent back. Of course, Grand Duke Grenoires would never say such a thing out loud. He just silently looked at the blood-stained helmet on the ground and thought to himself. Matthew sat firmly in the saddle, fully clothed. His shining breastplate was adorned with the candlelight medal he had won during the First War of the Black Roses. His spear was hanging from the saddle, and his hand was holding the family's ancestral sword, the Tooth of Turan. His body was as straight as a javelin. The north wind on the battlefield could not disorient this rider in the slightest. Instead, it lifted up his scarlet cloak like a beautiful flag. Forward, forward, maintain the formation. Matthew tried to control his soldiers to keep the formation intact as they crossed the river bank. It was a difficult challenge in this weather. People were constantly freezing and falling, and were immediately washed away by the bone-chilling river. But no one cared about the fallen men because they could not stand up again. The knight in charge of the supervision held a long whip and kept driving the noble's private soldiers forward. The knights at the front had already crossed the beach. They dismounted from their saddles and immediately wiped their mounts with dry cloth. The warhorses of the southern army were Grimoire's horses with the blood of magical beasts. These horses were born in the highlands and were extremely resistant to cold. However, they could not stand the terrible weather in this world of ice and snow. Further away, the knight was regrouping. The horses' hooves stepped on the snow, kicking up fine snow as they moved forward. Matthew's vanguard was attacking 7 or 8 manors, fortresses, and villages in the forest east of Menta. For both sides, the attack and defense of a fortress was not limited to the fortress itself. Although the defense system of Menta Fortress was simple, it still included a series of acropolises around it. In addition to the main road leading from Orda to Abes, the manors and villages in the forest also blocked the army's way to Schaflund. The Tonagel garrison was distributed in the forest. For Matthew, the commander in charge of commanding these local garrison troops was quite a clever opponent. The opponent's forces were limited, but they resisted in an orderly manner. At least so far, there were no signs of collapse. Matthew understood that the Duke was not satisfied with the progress in this direction, but his men were a mess, and not everyone obeyed his command. For example, on both sides of the river bank, there were 7 to 8 noble knights and feudal lords. Altogether, there were about 700 to 800 people. However, there were different orders, which seriously slowed down the speed of their march. What was more serious was that the noble knight was not only undisciplined and disobedient, but they also wanted to preserve their strength. No one was a fool in this war. The nobles would not work for others. It seemed that these nobles were hoping that the attack in the direction of Menta Fortress would make progress, so that they could win without a fight. Chapter 1485. Thinking of this, Matthew could not help but sigh. He shook his head and stopped thinking about these things that were too far away from him. The only thing he had to think about was how to take down the Tonagel's line of defense. The nobles had already taken down 3 or 4 villages, but they did not gain much. The Tonagel had retreated to the south bank of the Ord River to build a line of defense. Among them, Baron Gorham from Blackwater Bay was the fastest. According to the previous news, he had already taken down Emden, which was not far to the west of here. It was estimated that he would soon join forces with the attack from Orda. Hurry up! Matthew rubbed his frozen hands and shouted to his men, "Take down the manor in front of us. You can do whatever you want. The women and the property are all yours. But hurry up and don't let anyone else get to them first." The knight roared in agreement, but the footmen were still numb. Those things would not fall on their heads anyway. They dragged their feet forward in this weather, or fell down somewhere and could not get up again. It was all because of the knight's sword hanging over their heads. In this mood, the stiff soldiers finally reached the beach. The knight first ordered the archers to shoot a wave of fire arrows into the forest, but it was not ideal in such weather. The low temperature made the bows brittle, and the fire was not easy to ignite. A round of volley broke many bowstrings, and the rain of arrows could only be said to be an empty shell. But Matthew did not care about this. He immediately ordered the footmen to get into battle formation and advance into the forest. The Tonagel's line of defense loomed outside the manor. The opponent had well-maintained magic crossbows, which could still be lethal from 200 steps away in such a climate. Matthew could not help but curse the Tonagel's extravagance. Sure enough, the sound of bowstrings was soon heard from the front. Several footmen in the front row fell to the ground, and a commotion immediately broke out in the ranks. Matthew cursed when he saw this. However, he was familiar with such a situation. He immediately ordered the supervisors to step forward and kill a few soldiers who were hesitating. After that, the team was reorganized. Matthew knew very well that the enemy's number was not large, which was their biggest disadvantage. As long as his side remained stable, the enemy would not be able to resist. This was how they had won the previous battles. As expected, the Tonajal army began to retreat. Now, they still had some defensive depth, but their military strength was far from enough. When the other party had no space to retreat, it would be the time for the real showdown. Matthew was full of confidence. He saw that the tattered Abbey's collar emblem in the forest kept retreating. He did not know what happened in the end. Perhaps the flag bearer was killed, but the flag shook and fell down. Tonajal's rats are retreating again. The rebel army finally cheered, or rather, rejoiced. They don't dare to be our enemy. Chase after them and kill them. Similar scenes were playing out on the battlefield in Maxen Hill. The sudden appearance of the rebel army had almost defeated the local defenders of Maxen, who were caught off guard. Apart from the sporadic resistance, the Trondheim people were constantly retreating, or even being annihilated in most places. Matthew turned his head and saw that the southern nobles' flags had also been erected in Welland's direction. Flags representing their occupation were being erected south of the Ord River beach. The progress of the nobles' army had begun to accelerate, or rather, the Tonajal's resistance was getting weaker and weaker. It seems that we're going to win, Matthew thought to himself. But at that moment, the noble flag that had just been erected on the hill in the direction of Welland's ferry suddenly collapsed. Matthew happened to see this scene. He saw a knight rushing up the hill from the other side and cutting down the flag bearer with his sword. Matthew looked at all of this in horror. It must be the Tonajal cavalry, but why did they still have a fighting force here at this time? Not only did they not retreat, but they also attacked the Allied army's front line. Were these people crazy? He watched as one knight after another appeared on the mountaintop. The pitiful nobles' private soldiers that had occupied the mountaintop were all killed. The knights disdainfully threw the nobles' flags that had been chopped off on the ground. Then, another flag appeared on the mountaintop. The first thing that appeared was a spear tip engraved with the silver motif of the Arrow sacred lily. Then, the whole flag jumped up from the back of the hill. Matthew narrowed his eyes. It was not the battle flag of the White Lion Guards. Nor was it the heraldic flag of the Abbeys. It was a silver square flag that fluttered in the wind. The flag was painted with tassels, and a red ribbon surrounded by a silver star and a white moon. Under the star and moon was the sacred emblem of the royal family of Covardo. It was the flag of the Arrow sacred lily. Matthew's heart skipped a beat. He quickly bit off the grass root in his mouth and spat it on the ground. He turned around and shouted to his knight, "Line up! Line up! Let the spearmen move forward." A row of knights appeared on the hill, followed by a second row and a third row. They lined up neatly and rushed down the hill. Their silver armor shone under the bright sunlight, like a silver wave, and they directly swallowed the nobles' private soldiers who were fleeing down the hill in panic. In fact, there was another noble's army between them and the hill, but when Matthew saw the actions of the unlucky bastard, he knew that they could not save themselves or help him in any way. He could only pray that those damn idiots would not do him more harm than good. These Tonajal people must be crazy. Matthew's mind was in a mess. He finally realized who his opponent was. It was the Tonajal White Lion Knight. They must have come from Orda. But they dared to attack the front line of the Ord River. The noble knight not far away from him finally reacted. He hurriedly ordered his spearmen to turn around and regroup, but it was already too late. The riverbank began to tremble, and a silver wave had already appeared in the distance. Some people began to scream as they retreated. The remaining pikemen formed a thin line that could not stop the terrifying army. They were defeated in a single charge. Matthew saw with his own eyes that the noble knight was stabbed off his horse with a spear, and then his skull was crushed. His eyeballs splattered out with white brain matter and fell into a pile of snow. Their opponents showed no mercy. They did not show mercy because they were nobles. This was completely against the rules of Erewhon war. Even the undead of Madara would try their best to keep the noble knight alive in exchange for a large ransom later. These people must be demons. Matthew could not help but tremble. For the first time, he felt that his courage was not enough on the battlefield. He almost subconsciously retreated at that moment, but years of experience on the battlefield made him sober up. At this moment, he must not retreat. Retreat meant death. Several sorcerers suddenly appeared in the sky. These blue-robed sarcered sorcerers flew across the sky above his head and went straight for the White Lion Knights that had suddenly appeared. It was the Bugas. Matthew rejoiced that he was saved, but he had some doubts in his heart. Since when were there Buga wizards monitoring the battlefield in his direction? The silver folks reacted too quickly, and there were 4 of them at once. He had never seen so many Bugas wizards appear on the battlefield together since the battle in Ranner. The most time they were deployed was when they fought the Valkyrie Knight. It was said that the battle was earth-shattering. Unfortunately, he just missed that battle. The scene of 4 silver wizards joining forces made Matthew's blood boil. Although he knew that the other party did not care about a worthless noble knight like him in Erewhon, he still felt that it was worthwhile to be able to fight side by side with these powerful existences. The White Lion Knight had completely torn apart the scattered formation of the noble lord's spearmen in front of them, like a hot knife cutting through butter, without any hindrance. They continued to move forward and then swallowed up those who turned and fled, leaving almost no one alive. The river bank was covered in blood in an instant. The remaining knights of the noble lord roared and greeted them, but what awaited them was a similar fate. The legendary knights were more terrible than they imagined, and they were almost torn to pieces in an instant. Matthew had never seen such a bloody battle. It was said that only in a few battlefields in the Second Holy War, when the 2 sides were entangled in a frenzy, could there be a loss of 70 to 80%. As for the kind of battle where only 1 out of 10 survived, every soldier who had experienced such a nightmare was known as the survivor of a long war. His heart almost trembled with the sound of the other party's hooves, but the wizards above him finally gave him some courage and forced him to order his men to stand firm. Perhaps the miserable fate of the deserters in front of them had stimulated these numb noble private soldiers a little. No one in Matthew's team turned and retreated. Although the footmen were trembling and their formation was crooked, the triple spear formation at least gave them some psychological comfort. Matthew gasped for breath, trying to calm his nervous mind. Fortunately, his experience in the War of the Black Rose finally calmed him down a little. Chapter 1486. When the last noble knight on the battlefield was beheaded, the White Lion Knights did not stop and continued to charge in Matthew's direction. There were not many of them, but their aura was so powerful that the riverbank trembled slightly. The White Lion Knights were mounted knights, but when they mounted their warhorses, they were the most powerful cavalry in the kingdom. Lower, the spears. Matthew felt that his voice was out of tune. He had never been so nervous, not even when he was facing an army of skeletons during the First War of the Black Roses. He knew that if he lost this battle, he would not have the chance to regret it. The rows of spearmen lowered their spears. Then, a spell descended from the sky and landed on these inferior spears, causing the tips of the spears to shine with a faint purple light. Enchantment spell. Matthew was startled, and he subconsciously raised his head. Only then did he realize that a wizard had cast a spell on his team. This discovery made him extremely excited. With the enchantment of the spell, the spearman could finally threaten the knight. Of course, he might not be able to win, but at least his opponents would be wary of him. It would be best if they could bypass him and go for the weaklings behind him. At this critical juncture, Matthew could not help but think of preserving his strength. Unfortunately, the choice was not in his hands. He was soon shocked to find that the White Lion Knight seemed to be dismissive of his battle formation. The Tonagel Knights did not even stop for a moment and charged directly at him. Matthew even faintly heard a person giving an order. "Speed up, charge." It was a calm, but very young male voice. "Are you crazy?" Matthew almost wanted to shout at the lunatics opposite him. No matter what, the spearmen were still a threat to the riders. In a normal battle, even the most radical way of doing things was to constantly adjust the formation of the spearmen and then kill them with a single blow. How could they fight head-on like this? But he did not have time to think so much because the threat was right in front of him. Every spearman clenched their spears, and Matthew once again drew his sword. He knew that success or failure depended on this. 50 meters, 30 meters, 20 meters, just as the noble knight was about to shout, "Raise your spears," he suddenly widened his eyes in shock. This was because he saw a silver ripple sweeping out from between the White Lion Knights, hitting him right in the middle. At that moment, Matthew felt an irresistible force pulling his arm up, turning the long sword in his hand upside down, and piercing his own throat with the sword. "Ah! Ah!" Matthew screamed and tried in vain to pull his sword out, but all he could grab was a spurt of blood. He felt that his strength was disappearing, and his vision was spinning. He saw the Tonagel Knight rushing away from the spearmen who panicked because of the loss of command, knocking the poor men to the ground and trampling them to death. He saw that the thin formation was almost pierced through, and the soldiers fled in panic, screaming, and crashing into their nearby allies. Matthew closed his eyes in pain, but at the last moment of his life, he saw something crossing the sky and sliding down from his gradually dimming vision. In the end, the noble knight fell limply from his saddle and landed on his back. But the battle on the battlefield had just begun. 4 spells were intertwined in the sky. They were 4 silver lines that traversed the heavens and the earth. When cast by the Cisaldian wizards, they almost had the power to destroy the heavens and the earth. 4 beams of light swept through the forest, and hundreds of hectares of woodland evaporated into ashes. The spells cut the ground like sharp blades. When they swept across the frozen Ord River and shot toward the White Lion Knight, even the river water was cut into 4 sections. The ice in the river evaporated and rolled back, revealing the pebbled riverbed. But Brando just looked at this scene coldly. These people dared to use string magic in front of him. Compared to Senior, this level of draconic magic was simply a joke. He pulled out Extermination. This dark and twisted holy sword looked like a piece of scrap iron, but its curved blade was pregnant with the meaning of cutting all laws. He activated the Superior Authority. Cut into the 3rd layer of the Tiamat network. Cut off the source of the magic transmission. This series of actions was completed in an instant when Brando swung his sword. The 4 silver lines shattered in mid-air, but it was far from over. Because the connection between order and space was also cut off, the Cisaldian wizard's flying spell also failed, and they fell directly from mid-air. And this time, there was no longer a magic shield to protect them from harm. The bodies of the silver folk fell from a height of 100 meters to the ground, and the final result was nothing more than a pile of mud. Descend. Descend. Descend quickly, the opponent has anti-magic means. Some of the Cisaldian wizards, who were a little further away from Brando and had luckily escaped, were frightened by this scene and fled far away. The leader of the wizards among them shouted at the top of his lungs to signal the others to descend immediately. Brando held the dark and twisted long sword in his hand and looked around at the sky. In the area where the White Lion Knight was, there was no longer a Cisaldian wizard who dared to stay in midair. Holy Sword of Extermination. In the sky in another direction, wizards in gray or blue robes were gathering. However, everyone had a serious look on their faces, and some of them were even frowning. Edo, Huggins is dead, so are Depana and Carla. With the Holy Sword of Extermination, the opponent should be that person. He really did come back. Gather everyone. Aween's scouts made a mistake in their judgment. The opponent is definitely not a sword saint who specializes in illusions. A dignified voice rang out, causing everyone to turn around and look at the speaker. The person who spoke was Hollis Finn. He was a respected wizard among the Cisaldians, second only to Wizard Cisaldian. He was also the leader of this operation. He was a stern-looking, old-fashioned middle-aged man with two strange snow-white eyebrows on his handsome face. The sharp eyes hidden under the snow-white eyebrows glanced at everyone present and continued, "That is the elemental power of time and space, known as the law closest to the truth next to the power of existence. Our opponent is abnormally strong. He may have been taught by two men. I alone may not be a match for him. My lord," the wizards expressed their opinions, "we don't need to fight him alone. Since the target has appeared, shouldn't we inform the other side to enter the field?" Hollis nodded, "That's what I was thinking. As for the few unlucky fellows who died at Brando's hands, no one mentioned them anymore. The death of those apprentices was not a big deal to the Bugas. Although every silver person was extremely noble, the number of apprentices who died in various experiments every year was not small. Before they had the ability to become official wizards, even the Bugas themselves were just cannon fodder. It was just that the Bugas' requirements for official wizards were much higher than that of mortals. Only those who were true wizards were the most valuable assets of the Cisaldian alliance. On the plains on both sides of the Ord River, the battle between the Tonajol and the army of the southern border had just begun. The sacrifice of two lords in a row finally bought enough time for the others to react. The horn sounded. Except for a small number of people who chose to retreat at the first moment, the various noble armies chose to obey the order at the first moment and surrounded Brando and his White Lion Knight from both sides of the Ord River. This was a strange sight on the battlefield. The army from the north of the Ord River was closing in on a small dot on the battlefield, and in the middle of that dot was a group of Trenheim cavalry that was as weak as it could be. "My lord, what do we do next?" "Forward. Forward." Faced with such a tight encirclement, even the most daring person could not help but want to retreat. Although the White Lion Knight guards that Brando had groomed were the most outstanding youths of the Tonajol and even Erwin, they could not help but feel that there was no chance of victory in the current situation. Brando turned around and looked at the captain of the knight behind him. He was a rather handsome young man, and could even be said to be somewhat beautiful. He still had a childish air to him, and there were faint freckles on his face. His hair was a little curly, and his light brown eyes shone with an unusually determined light. "Are you afraid?" "Of course not. It's just that, my lord." Brando held judgment in his hand and pointed to the front. "The brown bear on the coat of arms is the coat of arms of the Cade family. This family is known for producing cowards, and they dare to show off in front of you. I want you to charge forward and pierce through the formation of those cowards. Poke a hole in the encirclement of the rebels. Is that okay?" The knight took a deep breath. Hot blood surged in their hearts. They were going to fight side by side with the most legendary hero of Erwin. It was only a few simple words, but they felt as if they were invincible. "Blow the horn," Brando said. The knight turned around and focused their gazes on the young knight captain. The latter quietly removed the white horn strap from his shoulder and lifted it with both hands. Another kind of deep horn sounded in the vast wilderness. The sound resonated with the wind, like the echo of the north wind, and echoed on both sides of the Ord River. The knight loosened the reins of their horses, sheathed their swords, and unsheathed their spears from under their saddles in unison. The magic runes on the White Lion armor were activated at this moment, and the light of magic flashed. The warhorse began to trot and gradually increased its speed. The ground rumbled. Chapter 1487. There was a faint humming sound in the north wind, and it passed through the battle cries, mixed with the snowflakes, and fell on the broken city wall. Maynard suddenly pricked up her ears. She stood up from the tower and looked thoughtfully in the direction of the perforation. There, in the direction of the old river, there was a vast expanse of white. In the distance, the shadow of the East Mintai forest hung in the sky like a dark cloud. The banners of various nobles were faintly discernible on the horizon. Lady Maynard, it's not advisable for you to move now. As soon as Reto walked into the tower, he saw the female knight's actions and could not help but remind her, you'd better rest. We can still hold on for a while after we join forces. And for some reason, the Bugis seem to have left. Did you hear that? What sound? Maynard looked back at the veteran and replied, it's the sound of a horn. That's the sound of a dragon horn. It's deeper than the usual horn sound. I've heard it once on the battlefield of Ampere Seal. Reto was slightly startled, thinking that the lady was hallucinating. But out of courtesy, he still listened carefully. But after a moment, the veteran's expression changed and he turned and rushed out. Maynard followed him out. Heavy snow was falling on the city wall. The rebel army's attack seemed to have stopped temporarily. The Bugis in the sky were also nowhere to be seen. Only the rebel camp in the distance was faintly discernible in the snow. The two stood by the battlements and looked in the direction of the old river. They could vaguely see the movement of the rebel army. Something seemed to be happening in that direction. Look over there, Maynard suddenly spoke. Leto followed her gaze and saw a flag breaking through the heavy encirclement of the rebel army. The flag dashed left and right among the various noble banners, like a reef in a storm, standing firm in the midst of the raging waves. That direction is Orta's reinforcements. He frowned, there are too few of them. What are they doing? They're courting death. No, Maynard hesitated for a moment, the sound of the horn is, the two of them suddenly froze. Who is that? Who is commanding that army? The Tonajal soldiers in the forest looked at each other. Their gazes pierced through the shadows of the trees, through the forest, and stared at the lone army on the north bank of the Ord River. He was like a lone knight who had fallen into a tight encirclement, but his opponents were unable to do anything to him. They've killed their way through the Cade family. Oh my God! Someone suddenly exclaimed, they have a chance now. Those damned Southerners haven't had the time to readjust their formation yet. Oh, Martha, they reacted so quickly and made such a perfect judgment. Where did these knights come from? But no one answered his question. Everyone held their breath as they watched the miraculous scene in front of them. The huge rebel army was actually disrupted by a mere 100 or so cavalrymen. The entire huge front line was being moved by this lone army. The rebel army, which was originally attacking the south from all directions, was now slowly turning around. The Tonajal defenders who were fighting the rebel army on various fronts found that the pressure in front of them was gradually decreasing. When the sound of the horn reverberated across the vast wilderness, the sound of the horn echoed across the vast wilderness. Everyone couldn't help but have such a thought. It's time to counterattack, that's the horn, someone reacted, they're calling for us. I've heard such a long sound before. It was on the battlefield of Ampere Seal, a White Lion knight recalled and said with slight excitement, that's the White Lion Legion's counterattack trombone. Our Lord once led us to launch a counterattack against the nobles in the north with such a sound. Then what are we waiting for? Look, they've raised the banner. Oh my God, what banner is that? Someone suddenly screamed. Everyone subconsciously turned their heads. Beside the silver lily flag fluttering in the stormy waves, a swallow-tailed flag was slowly rising. It was a sharp sword, the silhouette of Butchie's black pine leaves, the shadow of a golden dragon, and a blood-red vulture's tail flower as an ornament. The golden dragon was the family emblem of the Cardoloso family. The black pine of Butchie symbolized the beginning of a legend. The sharp sword was the symbol of the kingdom. The vulture's tail flower decorated the Caligo people's gentle and refined temperament. In the entire Erewhon kingdom, only one person was worthy of this flag. He was the hero in the hearts of every Erewhon people, and a godlike existence in Tonajol. Everyone stood in place in a daze. For a moment, they didn't know what words to use to express their feelings at this moment. Until another long sound of the horn came from within Fort Minty. It echoed the long sound of the horn from afar. Two long sounds of the horn, one high and one low, echoed each other on the battlefield. The Tonajol people finally came to their senses. Everyone looked at their companions and comrades beside them, and saw the same kind of passion in each other's eyes. His lordship is back. Fight for Erewhon. The knight shouted and rushed out of the battlefield. Looking down from the sky, it seemed as if a silver wave had suddenly appeared in East Minty Forest. Although their numbers weren't large, at this moment, they heavily struck the flank of the rebel army that was turning around. Sir Don Higgins could almost hear the sound of his teeth shattering. Why couldn't they stop a mere 100 cavalrymen? The armies of more than a dozen nobles kept surging forward, but they were constantly scattered by the enemy. An army of thousands could not stop a group of light cavalry that was 10 times their number. They could not even slow down the enemy's speed. Until he saw the silver-winged heavy cavalry of the Southern Legion that came from the north of Silverman being scattered by a mere 100 young knights, the confidence in his heart finally shattered. The light cavalry was turning around again, and their target was finally him. Sir Don Higgins instinctively told himself not to retreat. He was the commander-in-chief of the mixed army in this direction. If his men retreated, it would cause more than just a rout. Duke Grinoelson would kill him for that. But his rationality was defeated by his emotions, because there was a deeper voice in his heart that told him that if he didn't retreat, he would die here. He gave an order that couldn't be any more normal. Run! Sir Don Higgins and his troops turned around and retreated. The loosening of the rebel army's main formation caused a series of chain reactions. In the vast wilderness on the north bank of the Ord River, this temporary retreat turned into an avalanche in an instant. More and more people joined in this inexplicable retreat. It was as if it had started from a certain point, causing the whole area to break and fall apart. Brando sat on the back of his horse and just watched this scene calmly. In this era, the nobles' troops were so trashy. If it weren't for him, they would have been eliminated by the undead of Madara in the First and Second War of the Black Roses. Unfortunately, these people didn't know it. However, the knights around him were very excited because of this. The young men originally had the determination to die. They bravely and fearlessly accompanied their liege to charge into the trap. The surging blood and accelerated adrenaline made them not afraid of death at all. But to everyone's surprise, they actually succeeded. But they knew who it was because of. When they charged towards the spearmen of the Cade family, they realized that they weren't as cowards as their lord had described. On the contrary, the soldiers of the family with the brown bear as their emblem were all brave and fearless. They were the best nobles' private soldiers they had ever seen. However, it was at that moment that a powerful force of order suddenly descended upon everyone. When they turned around in shock, they discovered that their lord could actually extend the lines of law to a place 100 meters away and bless everyone with his elemental power. At that moment, the outcome was decided. The charge of 100 White Lion Knights, under the enhancement of the power of law, was almost equivalent to 100 elemental realm experts of the same level charging towards the spearmen of the Cade family. Even if this family was known for their bravery and fearlessness, it was useless. The young knights didn't understand what it meant to have this power bestowed upon them by their lord. This was because it was like the legend of the Cruise Knight, the 24 followers of the Wind Empress, and their king from 1,000 years ago. Like any ancient legend or myth, it was gradually buried under the dust of history. This was the power of the sage. When the core forces of the Noble Alliance were defeated, there was no one left on the battlefield who could stop this force. The battlefield was already in chaos. The banners of various nobles fled north in the wind and snow. Brando ordered the young White Lion Knights not only to lock down Don Higgins's army, but also to disperse any noble army that could possibly regroup on the battlefield. This would prevent the rebel army from organizing a counterattack and accelerate the process of their defeat. Soon, the defeated rebel army gradually scattered to the sides, opening up a path in the middle. Brando raised his head and noticed that an orderly army had appeared in the snow a mile or two away. This army was dressed in the same gray battle robes, a dark haze covering the horizon. When the knights saw the other party's banner, they couldn't help but turn to Brando. "My lord, they are," Brando waved his hand, stopping the knight's words. He had already recognized that it was the banner of Yenbao. He had long heard of this rebel army from the north and knew that they were involved in the plan to murder Prince Levin. Chapter 1488. When Yenbao's army appeared in Brando's field of vision, a loud voice came from the sky. "You really came back at the last moment, Count Tonagel, Mr. Brando, the grandson of the sword Saint Darius. Just like all the fairy tales and stories. It is a heroic knight who returns to the land at the last moment of the story to save the people who are suffering. How perfect!" The voice thundered in the gloomy sky. It sneered and said, "Unfortunately, reality is reality. Since we have already expected you to appear at this moment, don't you think you are too arrogant to appear here alone?" At this time, there was a sudden scream in front of them. The noble's army seemed to have stopped in that position, and there was a commotion. Brando raised his hand and signaled the Knight of the White Lion Guards to slow down. He looked up and saw the tragedy that was happening in that direction. There seemed to be a few huge portals in the wilderness. The portals slowly rotated, and behemoths with a crystal luster slowly walked out of these portals. These behemoths trampled into the crowd, and many of the noble soldiers were directly trampled into meat paste. Although Brando did not have any good feelings for these people who reaped what they sowed, he could not help but frown when he saw this scene. God, what kind of monsters are these? Are they on our side? That's Count Yenbao's voice, awe. At this moment, screams had already filled the air. Although the nobles and suzerains were fearful of the Trenthium's pursuit, the terrifying monsters in front of them were a much more direct threat. They pushed and retreated, slowly creeping towards the Trenthium's front line. Brando only let the young White Lion Guards kill the idiots who dared to rush into their formation in panic. As for the others, he did not continue to pursue. In fact, not only him, but the Tonagel people on the entire front line stopped. Obviously, everyone's attention was attracted by these new enemies. Suddenly, there was a new wave of screams and screams in front of them. An overwhelming number of Yetis swarmed out of another portal. These Yeti species had no feelings and almost no individual intelligence, so naturally, they attacked the first target they saw in front of them, so the nobles who were the slowest to escape bore the brunt of their attack. These terrifying dusk species were one of the most ruthless creatures in the world. They quickly flapped their thin wings and swept across the battlefield. Their open forelimbs were like sharp blades, directly cutting between the necks of the nobles and knights. The nobles of the southern territory fell one by one, and the area in front of the portal seemed to have turned into a bloody azure field in an instant. "Sir," Brando stopped his knight, whose expression had changed. He raised his head and silently looked at the gloomy sky. Over there, ring-shaped magic circles were unfolding one after another. It was as if a silver beam of light was shooting from the horizon, passing through these slowly rotating ring-shaped magic circles. The light rays converged outside the magic circles, forming silver battleships. However, these warships did not have the silver unicorn insignia of Kanaiji. Instead, they had pitch-black eyeballs on their sails. Those abstract eyes were looking at the land with a cold expression. It was the Cisaldian fleet. When this huge fleet appeared in the sky above Menta, Maynard immediately walked down the city walls. However, the copper dragon Redo grabbed her arm from behind, saying sternly, "What are you doing, Miss Maynard?" The knight was silent for a moment. "I can't let Mr. Brando face all of this alone. Even if I die, I want this kingdom to die with me." "I thought you didn't like his lordship, Mr. Redo. Now is not the time for jokes." Maynard frowned and replied with some dissatisfaction. It's just a joke." Redo laughed, but he shook his head. "You don't know his lordship well. Look at him, these pitiful creatures can't do anything to him." Maynard was slightly stunned. "His lordship is good at everything, but he has a bad habit of slapping people in the face." Redo sighed. "If it were me, I wouldn't have said so much nonsense to that guy. They're dead for sure. Just you wait, Miss Maynard. But right now, we do have something to do." "What do you mean?" Maynard turned around and sized up the veteran of the November War. She had always thought that these people were just experienced old soldiers, but the rumors about the survivors of the Long War seemed to be as miraculous as they were said to be. Redo gestured with his chin towards the north. The female knight turned around and raised her eyebrows slightly. "I see." She looked at him deeply and nodded. "I understand. Regardless of whether what you said is true or not, we can indeed go all out." After that, she held the hilt of her sword with one hand, turned around like a typical knight, and walked down the tower. However, Redo clearly saw that the female knight grimaced in pain when she turned around. What a stubborn little girl. He could not help but shake his head and think. Maynard walked down the stairs step by step. The wound on her chest was indeed excruciating, but she didn't seem to feel the waves of pain. She walked down the tower without a change in her expression. What a stubborn little girl. She heard a chuckle. This chuckle made her freeze on the spot. The female knight took in a light breath and looked around. After confirming that there was no one around, she asked in her heart with a slightly excited and surprised tone, "My lord, you're the only one. You're still alive, Miss Allium Japonicum. I thought you didn't like me." Maynard pursed her lips and did not directly respond to this question, but she still felt that her cheeks were a little hot. "We're the same person. There's no such thing as liking or not liking. You're finally willing to admit this. You've finally become mature and strong, Maynard." Allium Japonicum smiled slightly and spoke as if she was talking to her little sister. The female knight did not refute because she felt that the woman's tone was weaker than ever, which made her feel a little uneasy. "I've always resisted you, but that's just because I'm afraid. I'm sorry, you're affected by your dreams. You're full of pessimism about the future. You don't believe in anything. This is really like me at that time." Allium Japonicum smiled gently, "But all of this can be changed, Maynard. You should understand that the future is not fixed. The sword of fate is always in our hands. Both Sophie and I, and Brendel, believe in this. That's why we'll never give up on our hopes for tomorrow." In the darkness of the world of thoughts, Maynard felt someone holding her hand. It was a pure spiritual contact, but it made her feel warm. "Miss Allium Japonicum, call me sister, okay?" Allium Japonicum. "Sister. Listen, Maynard, I've given you my fate. I don't know if this is good or bad for you. In the future I see, the existence of the gold folk may not be a good thing for Erwin. But you have to remember that it's us who created fate, not fate who created you. Allium Japonicum. I may have to sleep for a while. Remember to say hello to Brando for me." Allium Japonicum replied gently, "I'm very optimistic about the two of you. You're both my dearest people. Don't worry about me, because I believe in Brando. He'll definitely find a way to save me." All sounds were silenced. Maynard stood on the stone stairs in a daze. She held a snowflake in her hand that was gradually melting. The atmosphere on the battlefield was almost frozen. The two sides that were still fighting each other in the wilderness seemed to have suddenly put down their disputes. The remaining noble lords and their armies scrambled to escape from the terrible monsters. They turned around and fled to the south again. Their original enemies, the Tonajal army and the young men of the White Lion Guards, let them go this time. They let these defeated soldiers pass through their front line and regroup at the rear. Some people were simply scared out of their wits and fled the battlefield directly, but no one paid attention to these people. There were more or less people who stayed behind, but everyone had a look of despair on their faces, as if doomsday had arrived. Even the dullest people understood at this moment that they had been used, especially when they saw those terrifying monsters, those cold and aloof Sissaldians. Their hearts could not help but be filled with fear and dismay. They even did not understand what kind of war they had been involved in. Until Brando spoke. "Your appearance reminds me of my own negligence." Brando's tone was very calm, as if he was talking about something that was completely unrelated to the current situation. But even though he spoke calmly, his voice spread throughout the entire battlefield, as if it was ringing in everyone's ears. This discovery made all of his enemies among the nobles in the south turn pale with fright and tremble, while all of his allies were shocked and excited. Because this was power, Brando raised his head. All for One usually has 3 representatives with the highest authority in a region. In the south, this representative should be Duke Arek. And in Ampere Seal, there's also a leading figure of the Holy Cathedral. My oversight was that I thought the remaining representative should be from Prince Levinonessen's side. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.